All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Welcome to the book launch for Flowers for Marx. Welcome to Conrad Hamilton and Matt McManus. How are you guys? Conrad is... Matt is
I'm
not
good.
audible. Okay, good. But anyways, hopefully McManus's video
You
recording.
can hear me, right?
Now we can.
Okay.
Yeah, weird.
Excellent. All right. Welcome.
Well, I guess we
Happy
can that we're
Friday.
good. Matt's sound works, so I'm good. There are, but
Yes. All right. Good. Well, folks are jumping on. We have a very exciting program. This is sort of a celebration. Usually we have pretty intense analytical discussions on Marxist books. But I think this book, Flowers for Marx, is a little different. It's actually has elements of humor from time to time. So it's a book that sort of emerges from the online space. It's not an academic Marxist book by, I think, any means, although there's a lot of serious, like, theoretical stuff going on at the same time. And I think one of the things I really like about this whole effort of Flowers for Marx is that precise bridge between the sort of seriousness of, like, I don't know, a grad seminar with, like, actual practical politics on the ground, and the way that all of the ideas tend to be conveyed in a very seamless way, and a very accessible way. This is a book published by Revolt Press, which is a very important newish independent press. One of their editors, Bram, will be with us later. So very excited to spotlight this book. But really, I think Conrad Hamilton is the sort of brainchild behind Flowers for Marx. And I wanted to introduce Conrad in the event that you guys don't know who he is. He is actually based in Shanghai at the East China Normal University. His PhD thesis was supervised by Caron Malibu, the French philosopher, and it deals with the relationship between value and agency in Marx. His work has been in Jacobin, Sublation Magazine, Cosmonaut, The Morning Star, Everyday Analysis, the South China Morning Post, and the Philosophical Salon, amongst other publications. He is also the co-host of the Archimedean Point, a new philosophical current events conjunctural analysis podcast that we do here at Emancipations. And it's always very fun to talk to Conrad. He's led two of our study groups with me, most recently, which is almost over actually, our work on Frederick Jameson's The Political Unconscious, which has been going very well. All of the videos are freely available on the YouTube page. And for folks that want to learn about our future study groups, sign up to the Patreon for Emancipations. Our Discord is super active, and it's sort of a blessing to have this sort of scholarly community that is para-academic. Before publishing Flowers for Marx, Conrad was the co-author of a book called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. And in my first conversation with him, we talked about his other forthcoming book, which is entitled Marxism Contra Subjectivity, on the concept of real abstraction. So I'm happy that comrades are starting to join our stream. We're going to be going at this for about 2.5 hours. So get cozy, get comfortable. A lot of very interesting folks are going to be coming on board. Matt, I'll introduce you in a moment, but Conrad, tell us just like very briefly where the book came from, where the idea came from, and sort of, what were you trying to do with Flowers for Marx?
yeah. Well, thank you for the question, Daniel, and thank you for the very warm introduction, I have to say. So the basic idea of the book, if we go back a few years, on Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. That book had several contributors: Matt, Burgess, myself, Marian Trejo. And it was really interesting, the timing of that, because that book actually came out in April 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And you know, maybe the book did very well, you know, by sort of theory book standards, but it was a little bit inopportune in the sense that you know, Jordan Peterson had sort of disappeared, right? This array of health problems he was having at this time, into these kind of odd Russian rehabilitations, so on and so forth. And COVID happened. And when COVID happened, you know, there was a lot of a real indication and discourse, but also this was occurring alongside other major events. So we think the fall of Corbyn was like began in December 2019. And around the same time our book came out, it was the same month, it was like April, Sanders was encountering serious difficulties in the Democratic primary. So you had this kind of confluence of factors around the book. And actually we launched a group that still exists called Capital Comrades. It's a Facebook discussion page. And without maybe a more direct in-person channel for expressing ourselves, it became a really, I think, interesting site of discussion with, you know, thousands of members. You know, Ben would, you know, come in and chime in to tell me, you know, wrong about China or whatever, you know, like lots of fun stuff and lots of memes and so on, obviously. You know, and then I think we could see at that time there was a difference that was also occurring with respect to the way that our respective politics were evolving. So I think if you go back to Myth and Mayhem, you know, Matt, Ben, and I were closer to like on the same page. Of course, we're all very good friends, regardless. But I do think there was a difference that was beginning to occur politically, because I personally began to become around that time, you know, critical of you know, the possibility of achieving success within this kind of democratic social work. And it wasn't that I totally rebuked it or found it to be devoid of social value as a sort of generational or class experience or what have you. You know, it's a little bit like the quote by, you know, Frederick Jameson, right? We have to support social democracy because, you know, it's fair is the necessary condition for the birth of an authentic left, right? So for me, just seeing that, you know, I felt like it was an invitation to pursue a more radical project, especially, you know, given the worsening and deepening of conditions that we were seeing around society at large. So I thought there was a receptivity to that. Obviously, you know, that kind of more stayed the line of democratic socialism, though obviously their views also have developed over time and changed, and I think they can offer you more information about that. But in any case, the book was, it went to Punctum. Some of you may know that the book was subsequently canceled by Punctum last year after, you know, a year and a half of kind of sitting around. And their rationale was that they provided a few reasons, but I think the most decisive one, in the sense that it couldn't have been fixed in editorial, was that they objected to the fact that Matt and Ben had published in certain platforms. Ben had been on Joe Rogan. You know, I think it was Quillette was another, in Compact were other sources of objection. In all these instances, by the way, they had taken a kind of adversarial position to the editorial line of these publications. They're promoting democratic socialism, but in any case, Ben wrote a very nice rebuke to that on Substack that received a fair bit of support. And voila, after that, we moved to Revolt, and some months later, here we are with a new foreword by Daniel Tutt. So that's about the history of the book for you.
Okay, great. All right, thank you for that. So the book itself poses a debate between the sort of viability of a sort of broader sort of what you might call latent set of Leninist tendencies on the left, although using the term Leninist is perhaps too broad. But what I find interesting about the posing of the debate that occurs between the various authors in the essays in the book is that this is the sort of debates that we live day in and day out, right? This is the sort of heart of, I mean, we're seeing this right now in New York with the Mamdani campaign. And there's a sort of like internal debate, which is actually, well, we definitely need to carve out some time to talk about Mamdani this afternoon. And I want folks in the chat to sort of weigh in on this, but I think there's a big question about left populism versus democratic socialism versus a form of Marxism, which would see democratic socialism as somehow too reformist or too sort of lightweight, or not even in line with Marx as such. And I actually want to tee up Matt McManus to jump in. In the event that you guys don't know Matt McManus, let me just give you a sense of his bio very quickly. Matt is a very prolific liberal socialist thinker, political theorist, has written actually several books. The Case for Liberal Socialism is one that we've talked about on 2 separate occasions on my podcast. Deeply enjoy every engagement that I have with Matt. He is a figure that writes from the left about the right in a way that is extremely rigorous. I think he probably publishes a book review once every week or 2 weeks. So he's always a good figure to read because he has an encyclopedic understanding of the far right and even of like just general conservative right, which I myself do not have that. And I think it's always helpful to engage with folks that really know where the right is coming from and that take the right seriously on an intellectual level. And let me also say, before I bring him on, that he is an incoming professor at Spelman College in Atlanta. So congratulations on that, Matt, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's good to see you again, buddy. Thanks a lot. And it's always a pleasure, right? Every time you and I chat, I feel like I've learned something, and I feel like I'm pushed to deepen my own position. So it's a real pleasure to be here.
So let's get a sense. Where are you at right now regarding your relationship to Marxism? Can you sort of situate your view as a liberal socialist? For starters, what does Marx sort of signify for your general project? I know it's a big question, but I think you can probably tackle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the kind of boilerplate summation of my philosophy has always been Rawlsian optimism of the will and Marxist pessimism of the intellect, which is a kind of idiom that I reiterate in my recent Substack essay on this volume, right? And there are kind of 2 reasons why I've combined these authors together, right? And I want to be clear that I'm not the first to do that by any means, right? Arguably, Rawls himself did that by drawing very much on Marx and Marxism, characterizing Marx as a heroic figure, for example. And of course, we have G.A. Cohen, Peffer, and a variety of others. But first off, I stress the importance of things like liberal socialism, in no small part because of the amount of time that I spent reading right-wing philosophy and engaging with the right, which you mentioned before. And I'll address that before moving on a little bit more specifically to how I understand Marx and Marxism. So I think when you spend a lot of time reading the right, particularly the more impressive figures in the tradition, Burke, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, etc., what you start to realize is that the granular distinctions that a lot of leftists like to dedicate a lot of time to mincing really aren't that politically or even theoretically interesting, because by and large, socialism and liberalism are mature Enlightenment doctrines that bear a lot of similarities to one another at a very deep, even metaphysical level, right? In terms of their commitment to things like liberty, equality, and solidarity for all, a scientific or rational apprehension of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all principles that, by and large, the right will sometimes adopt, but rejects pretty emphatically at the most kind of deepest level of its intuitions, right? The right is broadly committed to this idea that there's an intrinsic hierarchy to the world that is supposed to be represented in society. There are many different kind of metaphoric representations of this going all the way back to articulations of the great chain of being, right? Or, kind of this racially engendered social Darwinian hierarchy, right? But very often this also takes the form of indulging in irrationalism, mystification, mythologization, sometimes very self-consciously, as in the case of somebody like, say, Edmund Burke, who used to say that the all-conquering empire of light and reason was tearing away, as he put it, all the pleasing illusions that help glue society and its existent hierarchies together, right? So once one understands that, one can kind of realize that the gap between, say, Rawls, Marx, or liberalism and socialism is far narrower than it might appear if we take an expansive view of political possibilities that are available. Now, how does this relate back to my own kind of commitments to Marx? Well, as I say in my Substack essay that people can take a look at, I'm very much on Conrad's side and other people's side in thinking that it's important to engage in a ruthless criticism of what exists, particularly the forms of economic power that existed in society and the way that ideology plays a role in casting up what we might call necessary illusions as long as we inhabit a given social form, right?
Right.
But aligned with that, right, I don't think that we can lose sight of the importance of normatively arguing for the superiority of socialism, whatever flavor that you want, relative to other systems of political and economic organization. So I point out first off that there's this kind of Althusserian line which holds that Marx engaged in a moralistic kind of project up until, you can pick your point, right? The Grundrisse, the contribution to the critique of political economy, after which it became scientific and offered a scientific articulation of how communism or socialism would come to be, right? Now, this is a popular view that has received a lot of pushback in recent years, including by people like myself or others who I mentioned in that essay, Bruno Leopold, Vanessa Wills, etc., who point out that Marx, right up until the end of his days, in Capital Volume 3, for example, always made certain kinds of moral arguments about how a freer society that was no longer governed by necessity would be one where the development of human powers and capabilities would be an end in itself for the first time, et cetera, right? So I think that from a purely hermeneutical standpoint, the kind of contention that there's a scientific Marxism and a non-scientific Marxism might be true in terms of different traditions that emerge after Marx, but it'd be very, very difficult to hold that this is true of Marx himself, right? Given that there's a fusion of these different kind of idioms within his work, right? And I'm by no ways, again, unusual in making this kind of claim, right? Dave Harvey points out in his latest edition of How to Read Das Kapital that Marx makes moral arguments, descriptive arguments, historical arguments, economic arguments. They're littered throughout the book, along with a lot of put-downs, right? Now, the second reason that I think this is important is that for a very long time, socialists gained a lot of power by adopting what G.A. Cohen refers to as the obstetric vision of history, right? That ultimately socialist science demonstrated that the emergence of a higher form of society, itself a problematic term if you're just being descriptive, was inevitable, right? And all that we needed to really do was midwife this new society into being. And if we midwifed it effectively, then it would come into being healthier and earlier. And if you're a reactionary, you might be able to slow this process down. But one way or another, this was inevitable, right? And as I point out, it's very, very hard to deny that there's a kind of implicit teleological orientation to this obstetric projection, right? That one way or another, history is going to vindicate us. And consequently, the idea was that we don't really need to make moral arguments for the superiority of socialism. It's coming one way or another, just get, kind of deal with it.
Yeah.
Well, that becomes extremely implausible post-1989 and certainly 1991. And even if you do think that inevitably the contradictions of capitalism are going to bring about its downfall, I certainly see no evidence whatsoever that it's going to be replaced by a higher form of society. In fact, right now, it seems quite likely that what will replace it is a kind of ultra-nationalist authoritarianism, right? With corporatist features, right? You can call that capitalist if you want, but it's certainly not a capitalism that we're familiar with from the 19th or the 20th century. Consequently, I think that this means that the necessity of making moral arguments for socialism is now more urgent than it ever was before. And in addition to this, what we need to do, of course, is to put institutional meat onto the moral bones of our arguments to try to indicate how not only is a democratic socialist society going to be superior to its competitors, but it's also possible to move towards such a society in addition to it being desirable, right? And I think that one needs to recognize that this is always going to be a necessity, right? Even if you could prove that socialism was inevitable, which you can't, right? And I don't think it's very materialist to even suppose that you can. That by no means implies that that would necessarily be desirable unless you make moral arguments, right? I think that a lot of socialists have coasted for a long time on the idea that things like freedom and equality for all are just obviously better than less freedom and equality for all. So consequently, socialism will be better, and we don't even need to make that argument. Well, go talk to any conservative author, or go talk to Nietzsche, and he'll tell you very clearly what he thinks about this idea that a more free and equal society would be a better society, right? He'll tell you that not only is it not obvious, but in fact, the inverse is true. We should have less freedom and equality for everyone, right? So I think that we really need to give up on this science versus moralism debate, recognize that there's absolutely a vital necessity of engaging in a ruthless criticism of all that is to avoid descending into moralism. But accompanying that, right, you're never going to get away from the necessity of making moral argumentations or indulging in the burdens of moral judgment, as Marx points out.
All right. Very, very good. Very good. Well, we have some questions about the meaning of science, and I think that it's possible that our next guest may help us work through some of those questions. Thank you very much for that, Matt. And yes, okay, so we have our first guest in the house. Welcome to JP Caron. How are you, my friend?
Hello, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation.
So you're welcome. It's great to have you. Let me just do a quick introduction. So JP is a philosopher and musician based in Rio de Janeiro and also in Sao Paulo in Brazil. He lectures at the Federal University of Rio. He's also an instructor at the New Center for Research and Practice, which Conrad is also affiliated with the New Center. I didn't mention that. It's an extremely important para-academic place for folks to supplement their work in theory. Perhaps JP can tell you more about the New Center and sort of what it's all about. Currently, JP is writing 2 books, one on the relationship between language, rule following, forms of life, and value form in capitalism, and another one on the ontology of indeterminacy in experimental music from an inferentialist point of view. So welcome to our live stream on Marxism and the Future of the Left. So 2 questions, JP. What is Marxism for you? And then I want to ask you about science and Marxism. But first, just, tell us a little bit about like how you fit within this debate, given that really this forum is really about, I think Conrad gave one of the section titles of the book, Our Lives in Theory, right? So all is about this kind of, in some sense, practical relationship to Marxism. What is Marxism for you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, what is Marxism for me? Well, I would say it's a set of commitments. So I'm in line with Matt about the role of normativity. So it is a set of commitments that stem from a certain reading of the world. So you have to have both sides, like a descriptive side and the commitments that come from the descriptive side. But also, I must say I'm a Salarzian, which means the descriptive side is also normatively laden, which means if you uphold a statement or a belief, this is something that you have to do. There's like a cascading set of commitments that come from the fact that you uphold something to be true. So one of the interesting issues of the book for me is that like this kind of face-off between humanist Marxism and anti-humanist Marxism in terms of the role of moral reasoning. There's a bunch of ways to parse this debate. Like I've been thinking about this, preparing for this here. It would be part of my answer, I'd say. There's a bunch of ways to parse this out. One of them is like in terms of the role of moral reasoning. The other one is in terms of organizational theory. So it seems like humanism is like continuist, while anti-humanism is discontinuist in a certain sense. But anyway, the first sense is really important in the way that I would say like you could parse out normative commitments and the relationship between normative commitments and descriptions in a way that it doesn't fall onto moralism. Like it's not the same to say normative commitment and moralism, I would say. So yeah, I would say that science is also normatively laden.
Oh, wow. So let's let's see if we can get at a definition here of science. And also, I want to ask you about Wilfrid Sellars, because I just got done with a great discussion with Christoph Scheringa about the social history of analytic philosophy. And one of the questions I asked him was, what does he think about all of these Marxist philosophers like yourself and Ray Brassier that are also Salarsian? So first of all, what does it mean to be a Salarsian before we get to this question of science? What does that actually mean?
I mean, the work of Wilfrid Sellars, like, I think the most Salarsian thing about Sellars is that he carves a middle ground between many tendencies, but it's not as an ironic kind of thinker, more like somebody who excises certain conceptual connections and make them, like, rearrange them in such a way that he can uphold kind of commitments that at first seem like they are contradictory. So one of the most important things in Salarsian philosophy is the very familiar kind of, the first thing that you ever know about Sellars is that the duality between the manifest image and the scientific image, that there are two kind of master concepts of Sellars. And the tricky thing is that he's talking about images. So the manifest image is the way we go about things. And it's like, if we could say, like, in a layman's terms, it's a set of preconceptions on the way we see the world, and we think of ourselves as self-determined agents, even moral agents. This is part of the manifest image. For Sellars, the manifest image is not a given. It's like it's the result of a historical elaboration as well. So in a sense, it's a theory. Okay, so the manifest image, we don't know it is a theory, but it is theory-like in a sense. And the scientific image is overtly a theory. Like, the problem that Sellars is talking about in the 60s yet, so today's kind of state of the art in science is a bit different, but anyway, I think the kind of duality still holds, is that you have then a certain world, a certain image of the world that is made at the time of particles, not molar objects, not agents, not persons. So you don't see the same furniture in the scientific image as you see in the manifest image. And Sellars says we move in these images, within these images. So what's interesting is that at first we would say, like, is this like an idealist kind of philosophy? So we are always moving within an image of sorts. So where is the materiality in that? But the trickiest thing is Sellars is a scientific realist as well. So the thing is that he says, like, in the let us say, in the ultimate instance, science has the monopoly of a truth. So the scientific image ought to be true because it's more controlled. It enables more controlled predictions, and the manifest image has, like, then this kind of instrumental value where we move. We use it to move around. You could parse this in terms of also a multiscalar kind of analysis of our dealings with the world. So in a sense, it's a kind of, I would say, it's a non-reductive kind of scientific realism to be a Salarsian. You have to be, I mean, that would be unjust to people like Robert Brandon, who's not a scientific realist in any way, but he's a Salarsian, but in a different aspect to the aspect that I am a Salarsian. Like, he upholds basically the inferentialist philosophy of language, but not the scientific realism, which I uphold as well. So yeah,
I see.
Be a bit different.
So then, if you could answer perhaps like quickly, if possible, in the sense that I know that's a big question, which is some. Do you have a formula for, like, what science would be for Marxism, or, like, do you generally take the Althusserian view on that, or how do you situate science apropos Marxism?
I don't have a formula for what science would be for Marxism. Not really, because anything I would say about it lacks the kind of precise, necessary, and the necessary conditions for it to be and sufficient conditions for it to be a science. So I don't have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, but there's more to be said. There's something to be said about that. So if you take it like processually, like for instance, if you analyze the advent of a scientific image, the scientific image in this Salesian picture, broadly Salesian picture, comes through the resources of the manifest image. So the manifest image is historically prior. So what you do is like there's a categorical refinement that goes through history, right? That it's put forward in history, and there's a bunch of resources that come about that is embedded in language, for instance. And Sellers pays attention to the postulational resources. So you are able to describe things, right, with postulational entities, which are entities that you don't see, you don't touch, but they help you explain stuff, and sometimes they help you explain stuff better than what you see or touch. So in that sense, I think Sellers is compatible with Marxism in the sense that I take Marxism to be a materialism of abstraction. And this formula is not mine, is Ray Bercier. He says like, Marxism is a materialism of abstraction in the sense that you have to take seriously things like class and value and all these abstractions that are part and parcel of the descriptive resources of Marxism. So what Sellers says about science is if you postulate these entities and they are able to explain, to predict in a controlled way certain outcomes, you ought to consider these entities as real. So this is part of the scientific realism. So I don't have what I was saying. I don't have like a sufficient and necessary condition in the sense of, but then you have many other kind of things that could be scientific. You're right. It would be right if someone objects like that. But there is a gateway, like a passage between like this Salesian understanding of what is the constitution of a scientific image and what we ought to be upholding, ontologically committed, I would say, as Marxists, in terms of what kinds of entities are we using to read the world and thinking the world in terms of.
Yeah, then that goes back to the question of commitments and the means by which. But let me bring in Conrad to address science and Marxism. What's your take here, Conrad?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's, one of the things that emerges as a significant source of debate within the book is that, Matt frames his defense of, moralism or the need for normative commitments. I'm not going to say moralism, but the need for normative commitments, vis-a-vis what is, self-consciously labeled a kind of caricature, if you will, of Althusser, right? So it's not so much Althusser he's responding to, he says it's the Althusserians, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if we actually look at Althusser's writings more specifically, part of what's interesting, and this is like something that isn't maybe sufficiently recognized about his work, is that he did actually recognize the need for a kind of normative supplement to Marxism, right? So he says this, right? Like you can understand, historical materialism, right? You can understand relations of production, modes of production, social formations, and so on. But there's always going to be a gap, and this is why Julian Rose will say that he has this latent neo-Kantianism, but there's always going to be a gap, right? When you go to actually assert the need for revolution, because, ideology, as he puts it, is what makes things go, right? Ideology is what gives us, and this is the other thing that we have to remember about Althusser is that for him, it's a really narrow band of reality that's actually been scientized, right? So we could talk about, geometry, physics, biology, these different things, and he sees Marxism as being analogous to that as a science of history. But most of reality is precisely ideological, right? And this to the point where, philosophy for him, he'll often characterize as having no history, right? Because all that philosophy can sort of do as an ideological discourse is lend itself out to, whatever kind of, it lacks a certain independence, right, from the overall material structure. So I think that's, now I do think that, there's a problem of dualism that emerges with that kind of vision. And I would concur with Matt to that extent. Perhaps we'll get more time to discuss that. I mean, my general view is that the issue with Althusser's writing, and I share this criticism with Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who makes this point in Intellectual and Manual Labor, is that, you know, he has this, particularly prior to 1966, he has this very kind of rationalist view, where he'll say, you know, ideas come from the mind, right? And, you know, for Sohn-Rethel, in a way, the problem with this is that, you know, it precisely doesn't establish sufficiently the link between social being and consciousness, right? And could risk tipping into a kind of species of idealism for that reason. So I think one of Sohn-Rethel's really, really innovative ideas was to kind of, you know, seek the non-empirical basis of modern science, which Kant attributed to the a priori, right, in the structure of the commodity form itself, right, which I think is a very novel notion. But I will say this about Althusser's conception of science as well. I think that for English readers, you know, often it's very, very hard to understand the exercise that he's doing. And this is because there's a different history of philosophy of science within the English and French worlds, right? So, you know, if you look at, you know, English philosophy of science, I think, you know, Popper and falsificationism is like a major cornerstone of that. If you look at the French philosophy of science, you know, really, really important is French historical epistemology, right? You know, and then we have Gaston Bachelard, right? Very important, from whom the term epistemological break, right? Rupture epistémologique, right? And Althusser comes from. And part of what's interesting about French historical epistemology is that it refuses, in the way that Popper does, to supply a kind of meta-scientific criteria whereby we could say, well, this is like real science, this is not. Because what it sort of argues is that science is methodologically differentiated. And one of its interesting features, and this is sort of why it's so hard to pin down, is that it retroactively posits the conditions, right, for its own veracity, right? You know, so mathematics, of course, is very different than like a physical science, right? You know, of course, there's an element of transparency or reproducibility to it, but mathematics has to sort of, in its postulation, retroactively create like an abstract criterion for its own veracity in that way, if that makes sense. So it's into that kind of, you know, more slippery climate that Althusser is able to install this thesis that Marxism is a science. But, you know, but I do think it's very interesting with respect to, and Matt, you know, I do think he's correct because he critiques me in the book and he says, you know, well, all Conrad says is we can't rule out the possibility that it's a science. You know, he doesn't give a knockdown argument for it being a science. What a tall task that would be, right? But I do think it's interesting because part of the problem with like falsificationism, particularly in like your early Popperian kind of more, you know, slightly more reductive kind of approach, is that it ignores the fact that very often when sciences first are postulated, they're not actually falsifiable, right? So if we were to look at somebody like, you know, the early Galileo, for example, right? It would have been, you know, very, very difficult for him to demonstrate in some kind of, because it was just sort of an abductive hypothesis he was putting forth, right? And then he was kind of reaching for ways to justify it. And that was part of the church's argument against him at the time, right? Was that like, you know, this isn't just heresy, right? It's also just like bad science, right? Like you're just kind of throwing out ideas, right, that aren't sustainable. And I thought that was very interesting because, you know, I found this out when I was doing research that actually in 1989, Cardinal Ratzinger, he said that the church was right to persecute Galileo, you know, and he said because the science that he put forth was not falsifiable. So I think it, you know, I think it really is a caution against reaching a premature conclusion. So of course, I'm not a philosopher of science. I haven't written, you know, an 800-page book on why Marxism meets this criteria. But I do think that we should take, you know, we should take more seriously than maybe we tend to the hypothesis of Marxism as a science of history. Of course, that doesn't annul or negate the importance of the moral dimension either. And I think hopefully we'll have the chance to touch on what JP was talking about, the continuous and discontinuous political implications of humanism as well.
Okay, great. Thank you guys very much. I do want to broaden out our discussion to touch upon the main theme of today's event, which is the future of the left. And
Sorry,
perhaps one way. Well, yes, Matt, Matt, jump in on this debate, please, first. Before
sorry, yeah, no, I just need to go in 10 minutes. So I was wondering if I could have a chance to kind of articulate my position on it.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, please go, please.
Sorry, yeah, and I apologize for having to go again. I just have to catch a bus, and then I'm meeting a friend to say goodbye before I leave. But anyway, I think that our understanding of science has gone through a lot of permutations, and we'll start kind of with the early Enlightenment as a kind of paradigm, right? You know, the early Enlightenment is broadly understood as a period where science was understood as obtaining a degree of certainty in our apprehension of the world that wouldn't be available in other kind of disciplines. And what was difficult about this definition was that every person who articulated a philosophy of science at that time, or a method of scientific inquiry, came to different conclusions about what we could have certain knowledge of, right? There was a Cartesian paradigm that essentially stressed that analytical truths, those of logic, mathematics, etc., along with some philosophical conclusions with a paradigm of certainty. Then you also had a kind of Lockean and even Vicoian paradigm, which held that actually it's very difficult for human beings to say that we have certainty about anything in the natural world, because the natural world isn't something we created. By contrast, Vico, who sometimes held to actually be the first historicist, said we can have certain knowledge of human society in addition to the things that human beings create, precisely because we create them, right? We have maker's knowledge of the things that we establish in a way that we can't have maker's knowledge of phenomena in the natural world. Well, this quest for certainty, as everyone knows, was largely kind of upended by the time of mature Enlightenment for a wide variety of different reasons, right? Not least, developments within the hard sciences themselves, physics, mathematics, etc., in addition to epistemological shifts brought about by Kantianism, the emergence of fallibilism, etc., right? So you'd be very hard-pressed to find any philosopher of science that I know of today, or for that matter, even many working scientists, who would say we can obtain something like absolute certainty, even within domains where that was historically once thought possible, like, say, mathematics, right? Certainly post the Godelian Revolution. My kind of shorthand for understanding the state that we're in right now is that, broadly speaking, Aristotle was correct, right? Going all the way back to antiquity, that there are different discrete subject matters, and we can only expect a level of understanding in those subject matters that is concurrent with a level of knowledge that is appropriate to that subject matter, right? So we can have more certainty when it comes to things like mathematics and logic, or more knowledge when it comes to things like mathematics and logic is probably a better way to put it, than we can on normative questions or social scientific questions. So to me, the question of is Marxism scientific or not is to a certain degree besides the point, right? If what we're thinking of as science as a means of obtaining certainty about the social world, let alone about broader history, because I just agree with what JP said. That's never going to happen, right? But I do think that what Marx offers is a methodological approach to social scientific inquiry that gives us a better or richer understanding of history and the operations of society than many competing paradigms, to use a kind of Kuhnian term. And I do think that actually Marx lays out the kind of method of social scientific inquiry appropriate to his oeuvre quite clearly in the Grundrisse, right? So sad that we don't have a major published methodological work by Marx. He once said that he was going to write a little book on dialectic and then never got around to it, right? Apparently he was also planning on writing 10 volumes of Capital, and we only really got one that was published in his lifetime, right? But on the Grundrisse, he says, I think quite plausibly, that if you're going to try to engage in social scientific inquiry, invariably what you're going to start with is the concrete, right? Just the raw data about the world, right? This is how much a carton of milk costs at the grocery store, right? Or this is the kind of government that we have right now. And he points out, of course, if you just stick to the facts of society in any given time, that's not really going to teach you very much. What you need to do is move towards thinking about things in terms of more general abstract laws, right? So rather than just saying, this is how much a carton of milk costs at any given time, you might start to say, well, this is because of general laws that are operative within a capitalist society at any given time. The price of a carton of milk is dictated by the law of value or supply and demand, and there are competing theories about that, right? But then he takes a further step, which I would argue a lot of bourgeois economists don't do, and he was very critical of them for this, by saying you can't just rest by moving from the concrete to the abstract, or to moving to the abstract in thought. You need to move back to the concrete in thought, right? By constantly testing the validity of these abstract laws that you might come up with against the emerging material of the real world. And this is a very profound Marxist insight, because, of course, what he's saying is you can develop abstract laws that might be appropriate for any given time period, but you should never assume that those laws are trans-historical, that they're going to be operative at any given period of time, because, of course, changing material conditions might very well lead to changing social scientific laws, and we need to be receptive to this. Now, I have a paper that's coming out soon in Cultural Logic that defends Marx's methodological approach to these subject matters, very inspired by Mandel and his book Late Capitalism, which includes a critique, I should add, of Althusser, right? I think it has problems, and if you ascribe expectations to this methodology, like it's going to give you certainty of how the social world operates, let alone enable you to endorse this obstetric philosophy that this will allow you to make predictions about how the future is going to go, then you're invariably going to be disappointed, right? But if you accept a more humble understanding of what social science is capable of, then I think that Marx offers a lot that's of value, right? In terms of understanding the particular laws of capitalist political economy operative at any given time over the course of history, and also a sensitivity to the fact that those laws might very well change if material conditions, and for that matter also ideational conditions, change sufficiently.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. JP, I wanted to invite you to respond to anything you may have heard. And in the chat, people are asking if you might say more about this idea of commitments, how we might think of that grounding if Marxism is, which is a beautiful idea, but could you elaborate on it?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, what I was going to comment upon, I think, brings everything together. Like, it's also a response to the question of commitments. I think I'm in the middle ground here, like, in a sense, like, when I define Marxism as a set of commitments, I'd say, like, I'm giving credence to the kind of normative framework that's more closer to Matt. But at the same time, I find the division between science and ideology, as I just presented, like you have like almost like this a similar pairing in Sellers with the manifest and the scientific image. So what I think it's like the cash value in a sense of French epistemology that Conrad was mentioning is the fact that you have to have more precise and adequate concepts, and to have more precise and adequate concepts that are inferentially articulated within a theory. This means you have to take a distance. This means you have to take a distance from what is phenomenologically available, of the richness of concrete experience in a certain sense. So there's a working of the concept of abstraction that comes in and makes it so that science has always like a relationship to the epistemological obstacle, as Bachelard would say. So in a sense, I think Sellers is like also brings a kind of an interesting thing to the table, in the sense that this division is not so much a rupture, but it is embedded in the historical dynamics of self-understanding that is part and parcel of our language. So I would add something to the commitment thing. Like, I am of the maybe polemical belief that the philosophy of language that is compatible with historical materialism is a Wittgensteinian one, which means it's a philosophy of language, games, and use, which means it's a philosophy that is about dealings with the world and rule regulated kind of dealings, and it doesn't take for granted the referential purchase of like world relations. These world relations are constructed out of these games and the way we would build our society in a certain sense. So I think it's built in the very fact of language, naturalized. Bien entendu, you have to understand that it's a kind of a naturalized Wittgensteinianism that is an infrastructure for Sellers and other kinds of philosophy of language that are of interest here. And they are very compatible with historical materialism in that sense, because the foundation of these ideal abstractions, and I here uphold to John Hattle's framework with Conrad, like this I have in common with Conrad. Like, it's always like a kind of a dialectical relationship between like material saliences you get from the world that are turned into criterion for language use in a certain sense. A very familiar kind of example from Wittgenstein is a Parisian meter. Parisian meter is like an object. So you take that object as a criterion, and it becomes a rule for measuring things. So in a sense, you are always embedded in these material practices, in a sense. So Zonhattel would just make it so that offer a very powerful example of this when he shows, and I read Zonhattel as a thinker of rational bootstrapping, in a sense. So it is because we engage in certain material practices that we have more rational resources to describe the material practices themselves, in a sense. So it would be something like that. About commitments is, if I understand language to be like in the ground floor, like rule governed activity, you would have to have a concept of statement, a concept of a proposition that is compatible with that. What would be the concept of a statement or a proposition that is compatible with language, not as representation prima facie, but as a doing? That would be a commitment, which means if I say something, I am saying the content that I'm saying, but I am also committed to saying it. I'm committed to the truth of the statement, which means I ought to be committed to the consequences of the truth of that statement. So the kind of neo-pragmatic kind of theory of language stems from that dimension of doing that you take from, kind of Wittgensteinian infrastructure of language that is compatible with materialism, in my reading. So in a sense, like, commitments are all over the place. You don't really, they are not only overt conscious commitments, but whenever you say something, you are committing to something in that sense. So if you uphold Marxism as a certain form of reading of the world, you are committed to the truth, or to at least the sufficient set of statements that are part and parcel of Marxism in the way it reads the world and the way it offers prescriptions about changing that world. And what is interesting in that framework is that understanding is also changing, because commitments in terms of ground-based language games are always already changing as well. So you have like this kind of continuous thing between practice and the description of the practice. It's not completely continuous because you have a certain degree of complexity that makes it hard to read off these different stages of multiscalar analysis of cognition and practice and material practice and the basis, the practical basis of patterns that you use to learn of the same patterns, let us say, that are responsible for the capacity to reading of patterns in the world. Amazing.
Well, I think now I want to see if it's possible to take one of your courses at the New Center, because you're introducing a lot of things that are very interesting.
This is because the book is very congenial to what I do, like, in a sense. I think the thing that I'm doing is kind of cuts across many of the themes of the book. I'm not really agreeing with any one or the other party, but the kind of the thematic development of it is very kind of congenial to what I'm doing. And the kind of also, if I say like normativity ought not to be read of morality, I would also say that, referring to your preface, what was the counterpublic sphere? The counterpublic sphere is not predicated necessarily on a complete rupture, because the counterpublic sphere I would read as a certain set of commitments that are different, that creates a boundary to its outside. So in a sense, you still need certain commitments, and this is part and parcel of the framework of the subset of theoretical practice, which I was a member of until recently. Like, you have like this kind of analysis of the boundary between like a localized political movement and its outside, in a sense. But in a sense, you read that with like different commitments between the inside that obtained in the inside that are different from the outside,
right?
In a sense. So you can kind of use the framework to constitute the idea of a counterpublic sphere. For instance, I myself, I defend one of the recent papers that I published, defend punk, the original punk rock of the 70s, in that on that grounds, in a certain sense, because it operates at different social synthesis. It's not just about aesthetics.
Yeah.
And social synthesis is also like a correlate of these commitments and these practices that also comes from Zonhettel, in a sense. So
Beautiful.
I'm up there with Conrad in that.
Yeah, beautiful. JP, thank you for this very, very rich
Sorry, maybe too dense.
No. It's extremely interesting, and thank you for this wonderful debate that's happening in the YouTube chat. I think we're gonna slightly shift gears and introduce our next guest, Khadija Haynes. Welcome, Khadija. Thanks so much for joining us. So, Khadija, I wanted to sort of first of all introduce you. Oh, sorry. Let me mute you. There you go. Sorry, you have a little bit of feedback.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but when you put your mic on, it has like feedback. So we'll try it in a moment, but let me first introduce you, then I'll turn it to you. Khadija Haynes is actually an organizer with the Brooklyn Eviction Defense. So she's a tenant union organizer in New York. She's affiliated with the Medgar Evers College Coalition, and she's founder of Black People for Theory and Praxis. She's also a writer and a poet and a friend of our show. Khadija is very interested in dialectical theory and is a sort of autodidactic Marxist theoretician. We thought it would be wonderful to have you on. One of the things we're asking is a very big question, which is, what is Marxism for you? So that's what we will begin with, Khadija. Let's try your audio. If it doesn't work, you can leave and then come back. So let me mute. Everybody mute. Then we'll try her audio.
I'm sorry if it's a little... Is it okay? Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really hyped to be on. It's such a great podcast. I've watched, many of the podcasts with Conrad and all the erudite things that you say. So for me, Marxism in this day and age, I really take it, I feel like the dialectical underpinning, I feel like first understanding Hegel and that whole tradition, and understanding the sort of dialectic motion of not only just social movement, but of the world, like nature, and also like I think Spinoza is also important in this as well. So for me, I just feel like Marxism is that motion, that movement. That's my partner. Sorry. That motion, that move, coming into the sort of liberatory rupture and understanding, and breaking whatever fetters that keep us constrained and tight inside of not only this subjugation, but this sort of like mind-numbing sort of like it's kind of like I call it sometimes like a perpetual sort of murdering of yourself, where there's no understanding and there's no sort of movement to like grow in your consciousness. So yeah, that's what Marxism means for me.
Thank you, Khadija. You have a bit of a feedback, but I think I figured a solution, which is we'll just everyone mutes, and then when you talk, it's like still there, but it's not too bad. So, so as a follow-up to that, first of all, I wanted to ask you, as an organizer, how do you introduce Marxism to people that maybe don't have a formal like college degree, or are sort of alienated in some way, or they are like, how do you speak about Marxism to other working class people in the United States? And what do you recommend that they read? What are your sort of go-to points of recommendation?
Yeah, so in Brooklyn, where I am, what what I normally do is just try to relate it to their sort of everyday, like, you know, life, kind of, the gruel of just the toil of every day, and just say, like, I actually remember talking to someone, and they actually, like, I work with tenants, and one of the tenants actually chided me, because they said that, not all cops are bad. You shouldn't be talking about the police like that. And it's older, in some sectors, older black people, they have, in some instances, not all, a somewhat conservative outlook. And I just was like, listen, if you look around, people are being murdered. Like, the young man, I think Darrell Mickles, was just murdered like a few blocks away from us. So we really need to sort of question these, really, like, deep rooted beliefs that we had in this dichotomy of good cop, bad cop, and we need to think systemic. And maybe I don't use those kind of words, but, like, we just need to think broader instead of this very, like, hemmed in, the closed, sort of myopic view that we have, because everything is interrelated. And so I just try to, like, explain it like that, and people are like, oh, okay, I understand what you mean. So people get it, but to get it is not enough. I feel like the connection to the broader sort of structural problems, I think sometimes that's hard for people to see. I think people think in this very, like, atomized, sort of isolated, sort of way of thinking, instead of seeing how interrelated, and systemic everything is. So I feel like my job constantly is to make people understand this sort of movement of, the social sphere.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had two other questions for you. How, in your study of Marxism, first of all, like, what is your favorite theoretician? I know that you have studied Stalin a lot, and I wanted to ask you the meaning of Stalin for you. And I also wanted to ask you, so it's a two-part question, how you relate to the Black radical tradition and Marxism, and how you talk to comrades about the fusion between Marxism and the Black radical tradition. Could you speak to those 2 points?
Yeah, so, you know, uh, um, for me, like, the whole thing with Stalin just kind of never made sense. I'm not to say, like, I'm not, I don't have, like, any sort of, degree, or anything like this. I'm self-study, and I take a lot of classes about things. But I always look, like, my mom is from Grenada. And we kind of grew up knowing about Maurice Bishop. We grew up, kind of knowing about, like, the struggles in the 60s in Trinidad and Tobago, where my background is originally from, my lineage. And just kind of, like, understanding, like, all of the revolutionary theoreticians and the people in the movement and the trade union movement, which was a big thing in Trinidad with the oil workers union. A lot of them kind of looked to Stalin's leadership. So that's kind of the point that I sort of came at it with. Now, there's some problems there, and we can talk all day about the issues there, but just, like, historically, just in my sort of milieu, whenever I used to hear people just say the typical things that people say about Stalin, I would just always feel like, why am I hearing you say the same thing as, like, I'm hearing, like, this bourgeois historian, who hates communists say the same thing. It's just like very strange. I feel like now though, I feel like we can have, of course, critiques. Of course, you need to ruthlessly critique everything, as Marx said. I'm sorry if that's a plane overhead. But at the same time, I feel like all of the achievements of Stalin during that period is completely negated, and then you have these like sort of bogeyman tropes that people throw around without really, I guess, delving into the history of the period, why these sort of contentions and issues happen within the Soviet Union, instead of just parroting rhetoric that you may have heard from people who are viciously anti-communist.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to invite Conrad to jump in and say a few things in response to that. Although, actually, sorry, before you do that, I apologize. You didn't address the second question as much.
Yeah, I just...
As much.
No, I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot. So for the Black radical tradition, I come from a Pan-Africanist background. Initially, I was more Pan-Africanist centered. It's not until like my own struggles with working retail for a very long number of years, it just wasn't enough. And then I started to learn about Marx and Marxism, and I started to like get more into it. And I started to kind of break with the sort of more nationalistic, somewhat kind of bourgeois orientation of it, and learning more about like Kwame Ture, Sekou Touré, Walter Rodney, big influence on me, and just really understanding that the Black radical tradition is very it's heavy, right? It's very dense. We're talking about Claudia Jones. I actually used to be in the Communist Party USA for a few years until I left for some other reasons. You can ask me about that if you want. But yeah, just understanding Claudia Jones, Queen Mother Moore, Harry Haywood. They understood the essence and the powerful and the forcefulness of the Black radical tradition, but they didn't come with just a all Black agenda. They understood that we needed the entire working class to really hedge against capital, and they didn't come from it for this sort of lens of like a sort of bourgeois nationalistic or like spiritualist sort of lens that some people may have come with it. So that's my way of understanding Marxism in the Black radical.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Conrad, can you jump in for a couple minutes? And of course, Conrad is the signature cigarette. I think he's like one of the last people that actually smokes, at least the people that I know. But God bless you for that. Yes. Any thoughts on everything Khadija's laid out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting how it relates to the book, right? Because one of the big themes in the book, in the debate with McManus, is how we should relate to the history of what's sometimes termed actually existing socialism. And this also connects with the larger discussion around Althusser, right, and his views. So it's kind of interesting with like how Althusser conceptualizes Stalin. In a way, it's very equivocal, because he of course was responding to the denunciation of Stalin, 1956. He was also responding to the Sino-Soviet split, which was a little bit odd in the sense that, in spite of the considerable tensions that had existed between Mao and the Soviet establishment, Mao sort of came to the aid of the legacy of Stalin in a way during that period. And I think, Althusser has plenty of critiques of Stalin. And I think, among his most significant critiques are that there's a kind of progressive, kind of productivism that characterizes the Soviet Union in that time. So this kind of single-minded drive to develop the productive forces, right, that doesn't allot sufficient importance to the relations of production. He attributes, and this I'm sure is very contentious, but he attributes to Stalin a kind of humanism, right? He talks about, the notion of the new Soviet man and all of this. But he sees it as part of this idea that, this kind of teleological vision, right? Like the essence of socialism is within humans and the productive forces will develop, and okay. That having been said, he also is very critical of the denunciation of Stalin in 1956. And he's very close to Mao on this point, in the sense that, he understands that there were problems and abuses within the Stalinist period, but he feels that the way that the critique was advanced, right, that Stalin had a cult of personality, that there were violations of law, right? The way that it was advanced was essentially a kind of superstructural and bourgeois critique, right? In other words, it didn't really get to the bottom of these problems within the USSR. And as a result, it kind of it just kind of dispensed with the legacy of Stalin without taking into consideration sufficiently perhaps his strengths from Althusser's perspective as well. But it kind of dispenses with his legacy. But then the problems are going to continue, right? Which he sees as being part of this whole kind of demobilization, detente, and the various things that were going on, which explains why, in a certain sense, he was sympathetic to the Cultural Revolution. But I think, it's interesting because it's a good case of the fact that Althusser doesn't completely dismiss the utility of ideology, because when he talks about Stalin, he says, like, well, you don't have to have like a scientific conception of Marxism, in order to affect positive change in the world, right? So he says, dialectical materialism in Stalin's era may have been vulgarized in a lot of ways. But, like millions and millions of people were still raised out of poverty. The strategy of socialism in one country probably was like the right pivot after the failure of the European Civil War. He defeated Hitler. Obviously, we probably shouldn't forget that. So it's a good example how he sees that, even ideology can have a kind of valid application. But more generally on the subject of actually existing socialism and its legacy, and maybe to Khadija's point, and thank you so much, Khadija, for coming on. I appreciate it so much to have you here, and it seems like your work is so valuable, So, but to this point, I will say that, I think that someone really good, and he is brought up a little bit. He's a little bit spectral in the book. You'll notice him here and there, but is Samir Amin. Great, figure of African anti-colonial, anti-imperial resistance, obviously active in France as well. He was at Paris 8 University, for example, and someone who could, I think, partly because of his kind of mixed heritage, was very comfortable kind of weaving between kind of global North and global South sort of discourses. But, one thing that I think is really rich about Amin is the way he tries to kind of economically work out this stuff. So, he'll point out that, like, the problem, of course, is that at a certain point, imperialism, rather than bringing about some heightened global equality, it actually depresses severely and constrains the developmental levels of the countries that are imperialized. And that process took some time to actually clarify itself, because remember that, for a long time when people were making anti-colonial demands, the first demand was reform always, right? We want to reform the colonial structure. And it was only when that failed, right? Even in Haiti, if we go back, right? It's only when that failed that it transitions into something more radical. But what he points out is that to develop yourself economically at that level, what you really need to do is what he calls de-link from the world market. And you have to kind of cut yourself off. And, if you look at the economic successes of the 20th century, like, what were the biggest successes? Right? And probably 200 million people out of poverty in the USSR, 800 million people out of poverty in China, right? So I think that's a very, very, in of itself, like, that's an amazingly powerful case, right, for the potency of that strategy. Now, later on, some people did question his theory, because obviously if we talk about Chinese poverty alleviation, for example, part of it was the fact that they relinked with the world market to some degree, and they invited in investment, for example, right? But and a lot of people said, well, Amin's wrong, blah blah. But he was like, this doesn't contradict my point. Why was China able to succeed in taking in foreign investment and setting terms with respect to that foreign investment, and India was not in the same way, right? And let us remember that there's not a single language that over 50% of the Indian population speaks. If we want to talk about infrastructural difficulties, right? And Amin's point is it was the socialist period, the Maoist period, that created the foundations, right? That was going to actually allow China to not just relink equivocally, but to control the nature of that investment. And he's critical in some respects of this process, but he does understand how it has a kind of strategic utility. But I never understand this, and I will say I see it in the debate in the book. I see it in McManus. I see it in Bhaskar Sankara, who I discuss. I never understand this thing that people do, where they say like, socialism, like, because this is this kind of latent teleology within like the kind of democratic socialist idea, but like, those countries weren't ready for socialism. It wasn't real socialism, and it's like, well, like, even if that were true, right? And I'm not going to dispense with like every productivist notion here, but even if that's true, like, let's just for the sake of argument concede that point. What was better than what they did? Because like we just said, 200 million out of poverty in USSR, 800 million in China, like, they had to start somewhere, and that was the best place to start, right? To actually go about constructing those material conditions. And there was a real egalitarian aspect as well, insofar as it could be realized within that material setting. So I feel like you kind of, no matter what, this argument never works for me, because it's like, that's the basic kind of obstacle that it runs into, right? So you're either going to say that socialism's legitimate, right? But then even if you take this more productivist stance, right, I don't see the arguments against it as really holding water on that basis either, because you'd still have to conclude like, well, that was the best option economically, right?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Conrad. I suppose, Khadija, I want to invite you to respond to that, but it sounds like Stalin for you is inextricable from a colonial past, and I think that like, for all of its like shortcomings, Domenico Lasordo's book, The Black Legend, on Stalin does really center that reality of Stalin's role in liberation movements in the global South. Of course, it's a mixed record and so on and so forth. But anyways, just want to give you a chance to sort of respond to some of the things that Conrad said, and then we'll also bring in Dhruv Jain, who's patiently waiting on the back end. So let me mute, and then I'll unmute you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Conrad. So one of the things that I also talk about is this kind of notion where you have actually existing socialism and people fighting for actually existing socialism, and ideologically that becomes like sort of tethered to this authoritarian, monstrous thing that these people fighting for socialism and taking up arms are, it had this kind of Stalinist tendency inherently built into it or something like this. And I noticed that sort of sentiment like all throughout a lot of discourses. It's very, very like strange and upsetting to me. Even like I was listening to the talk and read some of Lukács, and the fact that people associated him also with being a quote unquote Stalinist, and people in I guess sometimes with Althusser, even though not so much, there was some talk about the sort of Stalinist strains or something like this there as well. And I just find it like it's so dishonest to me and strange, and I just think that it's just a way of people to kind of cut down any sort of like real push for liberation movements, especially when it comes to the colonized world. It's we see it with Palestine. No matter what these people do, they're authoritarian. I mean, they're the ones being completely annihilated, but for some reason they're inherently terroristic. No matter what they do, they just have a primordial terroristic, authoritative sort of nature, just because they want to take their liberation into their own hands. So it's like paradigmatic, like you follow this sort of thought pattern, and it ends up always in the same sort of point. And one of the things I just try to do is to sort of upend that sort of thinking. Although if people have certain sort of ideas in their head, whether you throw facts at them all day, it never goes anywhere really. But that's just how I try to deal with that sort of. It's not so much an anti-Stalinism as it is like a sort of anti any sort of actual push for liberation that's connected to a sort of belief that it is Stalinist and authoritative. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Khadija. Really gonna have to have you back on the show to actually talk about your work in tenant union organizing. I think comrades can learn quite a lot from what you're doing there. And hopefully, perhaps in the future, you might join us for like a study group. I've been meaning to do a study group on more like sort of elementary or sort of like basic Marxist texts that we often neglect, and even like some more rigorous work on dialectical materialism. So we would be honored to have you join us in the future. Welcome to our next guest, Dhruv Jain. Dhruv is a PhD in social and political thought at York University. Dhruv is has a forthcoming book on Louis Althusser and Machiavelli, which is called Machiavelli at the Gates. I'm not sure exactly when it comes out, but I believe that it's coming out somewhat soon. It may already be out. When it is out, by the way, Dhruv, we want to bring you onto the show to actually examine this particular work. Dhruv joined us for our study group on For Marx by Althusser. And I want to begin by asking you a big question, Dhruv, which I apologize in advance, but this is the question I'm asking everybody that comes onto this stream, which is, what is Marx and Marxism for you? Okay, so you do not have audio, so hang tight. Let me see here. Try it again. Yeah, you still do not have audio. Let's see. What you may want to do is go to the settings and see if you can link to the audio there. And then just make sure it's properly connected to the source that you want. Yeah, no, we cannot hear you. But in the meantime, I will invite Conrad to offer some nice entertainment for the audience.
Do you have a question? Do I just gotta go, or what?
You got a freestyle. You got to just on your own here while Dhruv figures this out.
Yeah, I think one thing that might be worth addressing like a little bit while Dhruv corrects his issues is that I think that JP was talking earlier a little bit about the continuous and discontinuous elements of this discourse, and we touched on that a little bit a minute ago when I was talking.
You're good. You're back. You're good, Dhruv. We heard you. Sorry. Yeah. So Conrad now can finish his thought. Then we'll go immediately to you.
Yeah. So I wanted to say that just on the continuous and discontinuous elements. So one thing that's very, very strong, Dhruv, as you would know, for example, is that within Althusser, there's a strong association of, humanism with the thought of continuity, right? So it's the idea of a kind of ideological guarantee, right? I think is the language he uses at one point, right? Humanism for him is a kind of transposition of the idea of God, right, to man, that's characteristic of the Enlightenment, right, and that often occurs within the context of capitalist social realism. But at bottom, and you see it, you could see it in a Smithian kind of discourse, right, where the attributes of rational competition are attributed to humans, and then a positive outcome will arrive through the invisible hand, right? In a way, in Althusser, what we have is a critique of this kind of spontaneism, right? Everything's going to be okay. Like, let's just keep going. And I do think, I think that part of the argument that McManus and I are in, and I also think that this is one of the mistakes that we made in terms of democratic socialist organization, in the 2010s, right? There was this idea like, okay, well, we can just kind of parachute, into a leadership, right? Someone who can exercise an entryist strategy like Sanders or Corbyn. Everyone's going to go along with it. And then you read these articles in Jacobin that are like, everyone loves public library. It's like, inside everyone, there's a socialist, right? And I think that one of the rude awakenings that we've had, especially in the last 5 years, there is no guarantee like that, right? That there has to be a much more tangible material process of organizing. And that I feel like some of these continuist, if you will, humanist ideas have contributed to a kind of passation, right, within that context. So with that said, I want to go over to Dhruv because it's
Yeah.
All
right, you're good.
So
Welcome.
I think so my name is Dhruv Jain. I got my PhD in 2017 from York, York University in Toronto, Canada, in social and political thought. My dissertation was a post-Althusserian interpretation of Machiavelli and the Epicurean roots of his theory on Machiavelli's. Interpretation of Machiavelli and the Epicurean roots of Machiavelli's theory of political causality. I'm no longer an academic. I actually work full-time in the field of politics as a political staffer and a campaign manager and a whole variety of other roles. However, I'm still working on a book, as you mentioned, for Brill on Althusser's interpretation of Machiavelli. And that's because I think that Althusser has a particularly useful interpretation of Machiavelli, which I think speaks to some of the tensions and debates that were in the book. Now, you asked me what is my relation to Marxism. I think and Marx. I think I think that that's a difficult question for me. But I'll be very honest. I'm no longer a Marxist. I spent many years of my life in the radical left, and then I was a Leninist at one point in my life. I then moved to being a democratic socialist, and now I'm basically a liberal, and I'm a member of the liberal movement in Canada. I do political work in that space, and my liberalism is both like there are left elements to it, so I'm very sympathetic, and I continue to work very closely with trade union stakeholders and stuff like that to get to help them win better gains. But there are also elements I think many of your viewers would find quite conservative and on the right, and I sort of try to draw on those two traditions. So, and the funny part is, I told a friend of mine that I was going to be speaking. I've been asked by you guys to come and speak about Marxism and the future of the left. And my friend was quipped, and he's like, "What's your contribution to say that there's no future?" And I'm going to. What I'm going to try to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is try to give you a little bit more than that, which is to say that I think that what I'm going to sort of speak to is perhaps someone who was once a part of the movement, who's left the movement, but I think has some insights that could be that are for politics in general, but which I think the left could learn from, and a lot of them are mediated through my sort of interpretation and engagement with Althusser. And in that sense, I remain an Althusserian. And I think that that's the funny part, as I'm probably the only non-Marxist Althusserian alive. I think of maybe some of his students who moved to the right in the last few years of their lives. Like I think probably are some of the last ones, but I think that in my own, a friend of mine joked recently we were talking about my political trajectory, and they said, Dhruv, were you ever a Marxist? And there are moments where I've kind of thought maybe I never was a Marxist, and I was always an Althusserian. And my commitment to Althusser goes back almost 20 years, and reading his works has really been much more impactful of my life than other texts.
So thank you for your candid sort of response, Dhruv. Can I ask a follow-up question about sort of, so you say, so like, okay, so when I launched my channel, Assad Haider and yourself joined me to study Sylvan Lazarus's Anthropology of the Name, which was really enjoyable. And I remember at that moment, you you did identify as a Marxist at that time in 2020.
Yeah.
So can you just tell us maybe a little bit more about, was this related to a sort of a set of practical concerns about your own political organization? And so if that's the case, Marxism in the future of the left, where would you diagnose that? How would you situate Marxism in the future of the left?
So, I definitely have, I think that by 2018, 2019, I was sort of leaving Marxism. And some of it was practical, some of it is theoretical frustration, some of it was movement-based frustrations. I think that the shift of the left, especially towards identity politics, really alienated someone like myself who remained committed to an economic version of politics. And I think that, I've looked at the left in the last 5, especially the last 6-7 years, but in the last 10 to 15 years is really having abandoned that. And I keep wanting to yell, using that old James Carville quote, "It's the economy, stupid." And I really feel like that's where the left has abandoned its own sort of.
But how is that the fault of Marxists? I'm confused.
Sure. Sure, because I think Marxists have been partly involved in the onboarding of that. So I think that I've seen a lot of Marxists themselves, and then on the other side, I think that Marxists, in my opinion, stopped answering real questions. And I think that that's something that Matt McManus talks about, is that a lot of the debates within the Marxist movement are kind of academic debates, which are interesting to you if you're a grad student or a postdoc or an academic. But like someone like myself whose day job is in politics, I find that what Marxists are debating is very different than what and the solution sets that are often available are very different. And I'm always looking for the best and the best solution, and also the best progressive solution. And sometimes, and I think that that's where my own frustrations with Marxism really came to the fore.
So you didn't feel it was necessary to remain steadfast and make a claim or an argument that the left was actually abandoning Marxism, that Marxism could help the crisis of identity politics and the move away from economics and class, etc. Why would you? Because a lot of Marxists, including I think myself and Conrad as well, probably see our vocation as Marxists trying to recenter material issues. Very much so.
Absolutely. And so I think that partly it's that, but I think it's also like, so I think that I partly did do that when I was still a Marxist, but I also think that for myself, like, when I think that somewhere, I think it was in somewhere in Conrad's intervention, he mentions, for example, one day we'll take over the private sector, and either through worker co-ops or purchase it all. I just don't think that that's a reality. And I think that that's where some of I think that we have to figure out, as a progressive series of solutions, how does one engage with the private sector? How does one, then that's where I think that my own reorientation towards how does one deal with the economy at large actually brought me away from Marxism, because I didn't think Marxism actually had any solutions besides a critique of capitalism. But I'm not really particularly interested right now in a critique of capitalism. I'm interested in how can we have good procurement policies around in a political sense of making sure whatever state procurement we're engaging in engages the market to get the best solutions out for customers and for citizens.
To be clear about the context of that intervention that you're talking about, so that was a paraphrase of the views of democratic socialism. So I just want people to know that that.
Yeah, and so I think that for myself, like I think that that's where for myself where I abandoned Marxism was that I became less and less interested in this theoretical project about smashing capitalism and stuff like that, and I became much more interested in other problems, and also kind of a re-engagement with what would be the business community, etc., like that.
Okay, well, I mean, I want to give Conrad a chance to respond to this, and I'm very happy that we brought you on, because I feel that part of the criticism that a lot of left liberals have of Marxism is either it's authoritarianism, it's dogmatism, it's rigidity. And perhaps one question I would have for you, Dhruv, is you said that Althusser is an exception.
Yeah.
why is that the case?
Sure.
And is it really possible, given that we know how Althusser's whole being was dedicated to the Communist Party, and is it really possible to be like an Althusserian liberal, if that's the right phrase?
So I think that actually that's really, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think that where for me it starts with is let's take something like the epistemological break. I think that there's a good argument that can be made from a Marxological perspective that Marx never actually experienced the epistemological break. And you can make a pretty good argument, and Althusser himself recognizes that, right? Althusser himself recognizes by the late writings that you have a situation where he's like, do you know what? Besides maybe the preface to the Capital Volume 1, some elements of Volume 3, and the notes on Wagner, Althusser, that there was always this infectation of a kind of humanism or Hegelianism or whatever else. Now, if you're a Marxologist, you're like, great, I can now dispense with Althusser. For me, that's not the point. I think that Althusser's intervention around the epistemological break is fundamentally important as to how does one orient themselves towards politics. And so I think that this is where I look at someone. So I agree with McManus that but then McManus says something like this. Now it would be very strange. It would be a very strange Marxist who didn't push back on this at least a little bit. They would argue that any consistent materialism should, of course, hold that it isn't really ideas that determine our political destiny, but material conditions and relations, but material conditions pushed hard enough that would lead to the conclusion that the impact of these disputes, whether theoretically edifying or not, is null. In other words, they don't really matter, to which I respond, yes, they don't really matter. And for me, this is the moment where I become an orthodox Althusserian again. I think it actually fundamentally matters, not that whether Marx had an epistemological break, but about whether we should have an epistemological break. And what does that mean for a political actor in trying to deal with the relationship between science and ideology, and then between theory and practice? So, when Conrad in his papers talks about, for me, the question of the epistemological break is the focus on how do you analyze material conditions and relations, and then determine the subsequent political steps. So what is important is what Althusser did try, as Conrad points out, which is take the intellectual avant-garde of his day and put it into a theoretical ensemble, drawing upon people like Bachelard. But as Ben Burgess and the rest of as that other essay points out, Cohen tries to do the same thing. Cohen tries with the analytical Marxists to abandon the French epistemological method, and that sort of thing which you were talking about earlier, Conrad, and replace it with an Anglo-American tradition, which is they argue is a better way of understanding the science of history. And so for me, the question is, what is the theoretical ensemble you need today to be an effective political person to actually do that? And, this is where McManus points out that there's a dualism at play here between science and humanism, which he then traces onto theory and practice. And this is where I think Machiavelli, for me, is more important figure than Marx. And I think in some ways, and that has got to do with the fact that for Althusser, what's particularly unique about Machiavelli is that he was both a philosopher and a practitioner. And that was what was Machiavelli's solitude. So someone like, and that comes from a critique actually of Althusser, or someone like Spinoza, who would say you can either be a philosopher or a political practitioner. And so I think that's that sort of ensemble that I'm trying to sort of take from Althusser. And that's maybe why I think that for me, it's not so much the content of Althusser's comments about Marx that are important, but some of the theoretical moves he's making about Machiavelli, Hobbes, and some of even the insights about Marx that I think that people like myself who work in politics can still uphold without necessarily upholding the ideological political package that Althusser advocated for in the 1960s and 70s.
Okay, great. Conrad, would you like to sort of respond to anything here?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny that you should say, that you're maybe one of the few liberal Althusserians, because I do think it's maybe more ideologically eclectic than we think. We had Panagiotis recently You were there as well, and you may remember that he said, well, in Greece there are right-wing Althusserians, right? So it's possible that this is more diffuse than we imagine. But to me, I should say, I think that this also attests to me to a certain kind of problem within Althusser's discourse. And I think it becomes, for me, this problem, it only reaches its apotheosis when he says, like, Critique of the Gotha Program and the Notes on Wagner are the only scientific parts of Marx. I mean, if we just want to be like Foucault, okay, right? But, the issue here is that, in his drive to break with teleology, right, in his drive to break with productivism, he took it so far that, he lost some of the tendential truths of these things. And we see this, within Gramsci, right, who will, it's not about teleology, right? It's about like an automatism immanent to material reality itself, right? If we look at the relationship of different modes of production and so on. And I think that, I always think that Frederick Jameson, right, has a very, very eloquent approach to this when he says, like, look, the problem with Althusser's critique of expressive causality is that, we always need narratives, right, to interpret reality. Like, there's always this narrative dimension that exists and that has to exist. I think for him, even Marx, like, would be a kind of means it in a very general sense. There are theoretical narratives as well. But that not all narratives are made equal, right? In other words, the real challenge, right, if we're doing something like social science, is to produce, narratives which are germane to actual things which have happened in reality. So, I think that really important. And I bring up like the Cohen, and I think the Cohen Althusser kind of different. We know that Cohen was influenced by Althusser early on, and then he went in quite a different direction. I do think that, there are a lot of commonalities, right? I mean, if you look at the rejection of value theory, if you look at, the critiques of dialectics, and so on, like analytical Marxism and Althusser, it's a bit different because Althusser wanted Marxist science, whereas analytical Marxism, scientizing Marxism, which are slightly different approaches. But, I think that I would say that, I think that it can actually be productive, because I think that one thing I do appreciate about Cohen's theory of history, for example, is the commitment to a kind of faithful rendering of something like a more productivist approach. But then I also think that, Althusser can be a nice complement to that if we're looking at the importance of relations of production, right? So, I think they have read those together, those very important branches of Marxology together in a productive way.
Wonderful. Dhruv, we want to sort of kind of wind down our time with you and give us a sense of when the book is coming out.
Sure.
And just tell the audience here, we have like a great audience watching on X and on YouTube here, what the book is actually about itself. I mean, you kind of alluded to it, but maybe elaborate a little bit more.
Sure. When's the book coming out? When I get time to finish the edits and actually convince the editor that it's actually ready for publication. So, hopefully sometime next year. I work full time and I work long days, so it's hard. Politics is pretty much a 24/7 job, so it's hard to find the time to go and do theoretical work nowadays. But what the book is about is basically retracing Althusser's multiple interpretations of Machiavelli, starting from about 1956 till about his death in 1989, and try to basically look at how Althusser shifts throughout his career in his interpretation of Machiavelli. And, when I pitched the book to Vittorio Mofino, I said to Vittorio, like, and I think the same kind of surprise that you guys had, I said to Vittorio, I'm not really interested in Althusser's Marxism. And he said to me, like, then what's the point? And I think that, and my argument is that Althusser has a lot more to offer philosophy and the study of Machiavelli than just his Marxism. I think that there's a very unique interpreter of the historical canon there that I think needs to be recovered actually from, and for which I think that Althusser is like a key figure, someone like Leo Strauss or any of those other major figures of interpretation that we have right now. And so I start with, for example, the fact that Althusser in 1956 and 1960 completely rejects Machiavelli and actually picks other figures. So for him, Montesquieu is a really big figure in 1959, and he's constantly taking potshots at Machiavelli in that book. But by 1961, I show that Althusser goes on holiday to Italy and has a new encounter with Machiavelli, which really reorients his entire political project. And I think that, and then that project goes through further revision in the 1970s. When he goes, so in 62 January, Althusser gives a bunch of lectures. He falls ill. He then abandons those lectures. But then Machiavelli starts showing up in some of his key works, as we talked about before, like Contradiction and Overdetermination. And Machiavelli starts changing his world. And then in 1972, he does another series of lectures on Machiavelli, which he then starts revising throughout the 70s and early 80s into what becomes Machiavelli and Us. But what's also really important is what really also becomes important is his studies in the 1970s of Epicurean philosophy. And he starts really reading all these new Epicurean books on Marx and Epicurus and all of this. And that really changes his further his modeling in the 1970s. And then I'm going to just drop one little thing. In the late 70s, Althusser starts reading a little bit of Leo Strauss, right? And he actually steals from Leo Strauss, in my argument, the aleatory tradition. Because Leo Strauss, actually, if you actually look in even the late writings, he mentions somewhere, Althusser says, this is great book by Victor Goldschmidt on Rousseau, where he talks about how Rousseau's an Epicurean. I went and found that book by Goldschmidt. And Goldschmidt's citation there is Leo Strauss. And then around that same time, Althusser goes and gets 2-3 books by Leo Strauss, like Natural Right and History and a couple of other books, and starts reading them. And what's really ironic is that the Natural Right and History by Leo Strauss that we have actually is a edited down version of his lectures. And the full lectures actually have all these additional comments about the relationship between these figures to Epicureanism, which actually would have bolstered Althusser's case. So I think that there's a bit of a missed encounter actually between Leo Strauss and Louis Althusser, which I talk about briefly in the period of the 80s. But that's what my book is. It's basically an attempt to reconstruct Althusser's reading from the 1960s and 70s. So I go and try to trace down every book he reads on Machiavelli and try to glean what they're grabbing from it, and other books as well.
Wonderful. Dhruv, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed it very much. We're not going to like flay you or sort of castrate you or do some sort of humiliation ritual or struggle session with you. Although we certainly wish for you to come back to the fold, as it were, ideologically, but that will not prohibit me from interviewing you about this book, which I think will make a very important contribution to the scholarship. I just want to briefly remind folks to do one thing for me, for all of us here, which is to go. I'll put this in the chat here and buy the book. Flowers for Marx, Ben Burgess, Conrad Hamilton, Matt McManus, Ernesto Vargas, forward by me. Here is the link. I'm going to put it in the chat. Everyone can go buy the book. It just came out today, and it is a reasonable price. Unlike a lot of academic books, this is very reasonably priced. So, let us know in the chat if you plan to buy it. It's probably not yet on like LibGen or one of the illegal sources. Of course,
I'll get on that.
We're not going to penalize you for that. But the reason that I want you guys to buy this is to support the publisher. The writers don't really make much money off of this, but the publisher, Revolt Press, is filling a niche space right now in the left sort of counterpublic space, and we believe and we feel very strongly that it's worth supporting. So buy the book. Okay, end of spiel. Now I will stop sharing and welcome Marina Simakova to the program. Hello, Marina.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here. We have went from a Stalinist-friendly tenant union organizer to a former Marxist Althusserian, and now we are with you. Let me introduce you to the audience in the event that folks are not familiar with you. You are an intellectual historian. You explore the relationship between ideas and ideologies. Marina's work is situated at the intersection of Marxism, modern history, and political journalism. In Marina's current study, she is tracing the idea of intellectual autonomy of the worker as it featured in the Italian scene and Italian discussions of the early 20th century. Marina is also an activist, an editor, and a political writer. So thank you so much for coming to this book launch and to being on Emancipations. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me tonight.
Yes. So tell us, and this is you've already heard me ask this crazy question to the prior guests. Marina, what is Marxism for you?
Well, I've been doing Marxism for quite a while. So I guess there's gonna be an elaborate answer. For me, I guess Marxism is, first of all, is an intellectual movement, and an intellectual movement which is founded on three pillars. First is the centrality of social relations in politics. And by social relations, I understand actually the sociality, the driving force, something that makes people, come together. And I guess there's been a lot of philosophical discussions on of what kind of force it is, starting from the Enlightenment tradition and Rousseau in particular. So this is the first pillar, sociality, and as the core, the center of politics. Second pillar is labor as the driving force of historical development and as a sort of ultimate reality of a bigger ontological project, because everything around us, including ourselves, is the product of collective labor. And the third pillar is basically comes from the very basic principle which Marx outlined in the general rules of the First Labor Association, which will later be known as the First International. And the rule is that emancipatory politics, which holds emancipatory politics holds that the emancipation of any subject is an act carried out by the subject itself. So if we get to the first pillar, I think it has always been one of the most maybe philosophically rich and interesting to me, because it's a philosophical project within the intellectual movement. Marxism departs from sociality as the core of and the truth of political life. And at the same time, it not only asserts it, but asserting sociality as the core of the political life, it sort of aims to politicize historically concrete dimensions of sociality. Yes, it departs from the idea that people tend to associate kind of naturally, but historically there are both obstacles on the way to association of people and possibilities for it. And these possibilities are not always clear, not yet clear. The present is always sort of pregnant with these possibilities. And I guess another thing which I haven't mentioned as among these fundamental pillars of Marxism, but I guess which has to be mentioned today, is the notion of class. I do not believe in Marxism without a class. I think that whatever language, vocabulary we use, speaking about social relations, relations of production, and inequalities existing in different societies across the globe, a certain conception of class is necessary. For example, if we speak about the book, which we've been discussing today, I think what I appreciated the most about it is that you guys are trying to bridge these three different domains: the media, the academic, and the political domain, which unfortunately, yes, they intersect, and people, come from one place to another, from one domain to another, but there's still a gap between each of them, and I think like bridging these three domains. What I appreciated the most is that you're trying to sort of rejuvenate or remind us about the function of the intellectual. So I guess Marxism implies a very particular role of the intellectual which cannot not do politics. And maybe it's high time to sort of emancipate the intellectual from the ivory tower of academic knowledge. So Marxism, and I see it in a very, I've done quite a lot of work on Gramsci and on the figure of the worker as an intellectual, both like in the telephone and in discussion in Italian socialism and in a Russian pre-revolutionary social democracy. So I think Marxism always implies a particular role of the intellectual, a political intellectual who always belongs to a particular class, but to a certain extent can betray her class. This is basically it. Maybe another thing I would add, that Marxism presupposes a twofold reflection. On the one hand, it's a reflection on the conditions of its possibilities, and on the other hand, a reflection on what it does politically, what's its practice. Even if this practice is writing or talking, what you're doing with these conditions of the possibility of your the emergence of your movement or your thought of, or just getting together today. For example, Marxism is an ism. Okay, what the question is, what it does with itself being an ism.
Brilliant. Well, first of all, welcome to Emancipation's platform. It's really great to have you. I have two follow-up questions based on everything you said, which is, do you understand these pillars as connected to the idea that JP mentioned at the beginning of commitment? And do you have a theory of commitment? What does it mean to be committed as a Marxist? I think that's a good question, because we were just speaking to somebody who's no longer committed as a Marxist, which of course for me is kind of makes me a little bit anxious to hear somebody like I get like concerned, obviously you are committed, because when you use pillars, one my immediate thought is Islam and their 5 pillars, which of course those pillars are affirmations of a testament of belief. Like they are required, they are obligatory. How do you understand commitment in relationship to these 3 pillars you've articulated?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a great question, and I think the whole theory of commitment, which JP was trying to sketch and share with us, is immensely interesting. I must confess, I've never I never ever thought about commitment in that respect in the Marxian context, even though I've been always curious and found it like necessary to bring non-Marxian vocabulary to the Marxist discussion. I think so. Just I think the very idea of commitment has a lot of potential in two respects. First, it helps us distinguish between political ideologies and religion. So there's commitment and there's belief, and I think it's an ongoing discussion to what extent socialism was a religion, could be a religion, or was a political religion. I'm generally, was always, I've always tried to debunk this conflation between the two, because I believe that these are two very, very different things. And I think in the book, Conrad also raises this point that, the science, referring to Althusser, religion is an idea, can be seen as an ideological form of sorts, but it's not ideology. Even though both science and religion can, if we look at them philosophically, can have this ideological dimension which we could trace. So I think it would be very interesting to work with this idea of commitment in order to, to distinguish it from belief, to sort of problematize and assert this connection of an activist with what she's doing without employing the theological apparatus or or terminological apparatus associated with religious studies or theology. And another thing why I find this idea of commitment really compelling and valuable is because it raises again the question of the normative dimension of politics. And I think it's very difficult to argue against the fact to argue against the fact that politics, whether it's right wing or leftist, has been losing this social dimension, on which, not necessarily economical, but social, on which I insisted at the very beginning, and shifting really to the normative dimension. So if we do not reject the normative dimension of politics, whether we are pro-humanist or pro-scientific in this theoretical debate, and if we try to build on it or appropriate the normative politics from the right, then again, this idea of commitment can help. However, I don't have my own theory of it. I've never thought of it, and I can't, quickly come up with any critique either.
That's fair. That's very good. As well, one follow-up question about your research into worker intellectuals. I interviewed Jacques Rancière on my show. Obviously, he has elaborate studies of worker intellectuals. How did Flowers for Marx as a book connect to that theme for you? And what is the significance of that, perhaps, like, historically, and how that figure might be necessary for our contemporary moment? Have you thought about that much?
Yes, I've thought about that while reading, because what I think I've been slightly missing, or lacking in the book is precisely its reflection on what this book, as a theoretical intervention and especially as a political intervention into public discourse, is doing. So I think this function of an intellectual, especially if we think of it in this Gramscian tradition, with all this kind of Sorelian baggage, syndicalist baggage that Gramscian thought both rejected and affirmed, like dialectical on a certain level. I think this intellectual work or intellectual contribution of workers is pretty much a product of their action. So they are intellectuals by doing something, or when they get together and read a leaflet or discuss how to go on strike and how the strike should be organized. This action and this practice is a form of reasoning and intellectual work.
That's a very powerful motif, which is then do you then assign Gramsci's category of the organic intellectual, which I think Althusser actually, you may remember, Conrad, was critical of that in For Marx, yeah? And because the presupposition to the Gramscian organic intellectual is almost like a universal presupposition that actually every worker is an intellectual in utero or in potential. So do you affirm that view? And do you then how do you then fit that into perhaps like, the Leninist view, which oftentimes gets sort of funneled through something like a question internal to Marxism about the danger of not repeating like the elitism of Blanqui, because that was one of the most significant breaks of Marx and Engels. And I always think of this historically, as you're probably familiar from the 19th century, as like a egalitarian pedagogy is at the heart of Marxism, no matter how you slice it. So tell us about the meaning perhaps of the organic intellectual for Gramsci, and like how you fall on this definition. I know you've kind of articulated, because this is very much like, I think, speaking now for myself, but also for like the mission of my program, this is like so essential for us to maintain this. But there does seem to be a lot of misunderstanding about it. Can you say more about this question?
Well, this is a big question, and of course we will spend hours and hours on discussing how the very idea of organic intellectual emerged or came to Gramsci's head and developed throughout his prison writings. I think there are several things that we have to keep in mind here, that this pedagogy, I will probably begin with the last bit of your question, with this pedagogical project. I think we often tend to to think of a pedagogical project as of a kind of very, in very constructive terms, as a project as an emancipatory project. Of course, this dimension is pretty much there, but as Gramsci said, hegemony is a pedagogical relationship. So I think there's this ideological element in it, which we probably shouldn't should keep in mind. And then coming to the organic intellectual, I guess I'd prefer to be really candid here and honest. I think if we accept that Gramsci, at least after his visit to Moscow and being in prison, thinking about fascism and many other things, if we accept that he sort of developed in a more Leninist direction, and the whole theory of hegemony comes from his attempt to understand what dictatorship of the proletariat is. I guess then another category, like a Leninist idea of a professional revolutionary, may be helpful, meaning that organic intellectual is not only an intellectual that belongs to a particular class and not and and has sort of so organic intellectual is not only a function, but it's also a very particular kind of political work. Organic intellectual does politics and does propaganda. And today, I guess propaganda often features as a pejorative. And I think it was even in the book about ideology and freedom, we sort of tend to assume that any kind of ideological, any kind of ideology limits our freedom, is a limit to our freedom, which is debatable. Back then, like 100 years ago, 120 years ago, propaganda was not a pejorative. Of course, you propagate certain idea. This is politics. You're trying to convince both your allies and your adversaries that the ideas you propagate is the truth of their own politics. So I know I'm probably not elaborating on the very concept of organic intellectual, because I think there's so much has been written on it. I wanted to bring,
thank you,
to highlight this particular element of this political work organic intellectual is doing.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's really a joy to have you articulate your thoughts on the book and these general ideas. Thank you for entertaining my big questions. I'll turn it over to Conrad to see if you have any thoughts or interventions that you'd like to raise as well.
Yeah, well, I do think that, it was interesting when you talked about Althusser's critique of the organic intellectual as being based on the kind of spontaneous premise that it carries. And this goes back to Althusser's larger critique of Gramsci, which I think Andrei Tossel writes. It was like the last great debate of Marxism, right? Which I don't know, maybe some will find a little bit hyperbolic, but in kind of two parts to it, right? One of them in 1965, another in 1978. And so I think really if we distill the two essential points, the first one is that Althusser perceives within Gramsci, and for all the richness of his kind of commentaries on the superstructure and so on, and hegemony, he perceives a kind of latent teleological dimension within it, right? Because of this residual attachment to Hegel. So he sees it ultimately as a kind of species of Marxist humanism that could risk being pacified in that way, or pacifying in that way. And I think, you know, part of this has to do with the sense that, you know, Gramsci is sometimes a little bit blasé about the scientific properties of Marxism. You know, so when he talks about prediction, for example, he's like, well, you know, even if we're wrong in our predictions about the future, you know, in a way, the function of this is to like bind together a political coalition, right? And I think Althusser, in his own odd way, has this fidelity to the concept of dialectical materialism, you know, and I think that he sees it in this sort of, you know, kind of Leninist way, like you were saying, Daniel, right? We could go back to the merger formula by Kautsky, right? The way that Marxism kind of comes from, or socialism kind of comes from intellectuals, and then it's bounded to workers by Marx, but that without the contribution of intellectuals, this couldn't have been produced. You know, I think in a way that he sees the absence of a certain kind of dialectical materialist basis within Gramsci as depriving him of a necessary level of orientation with respect to the need for rupture, right? So risk of a kind of dialectical harmonization. And of course, the second major critique, which is articulated in Cofer and Work to be Done, brassy title, to be sure, to name a book. But the second critique is that Gramsci, and this was partly directed against Eurocommunism, if you really want to historicize, but that Gramsci doesn't do sufficient justice to the material embeddedness of the state, right? So there's a certain kind of inadequacy, you know, to the formula of kind of hegemony or the march through the institutions, you know, because the state, as Althusser says, is constructed as thoroughly as possible to be totally oblivious to what's going on outside. There's a kind of, you know, almost like a bit of a Schmittian way. There's like a hard kernel of sovereignty there in some sense, which dictates the need for revolution. So I think that these are really, really, I think that debate, you know, is really, really important for us to go back to. Also because, in a sense, it plays a role in this book, right? Because the theme, right, for rupture versus a kind of continuity, right, which I democratic socialism for, though let's be clear, is very different than Gramsci in his terms. And all of us remembering that, you know, Gramsci has been, and I'm not, you know, cannot reduce Gramsci to just like reform. You know, we have to understand the historical situatedness of Althusser's critiques, but there is a long history, right? Whether we're talking about, you know, the post-war politics of the PHE, and the way Gramsci was used there to justify a kind of assimilation to the state. We're talking about kind of the cultural Gramsci, you know, of the 60s and 70s, right, associated with the left. You know, whether we're talking about post-Marxism, Clow and Mouffe, right? There is this like long history, right, of Gramsci for the purpose of justifying a certain kind of reformism. And I don't think that we can say that that has nothing to do with his work either, right? We can't reduce his work to that, but I think that's important to recognize as well. So that's what I have to add to that.
Okay, fabulous. Well, Marina, we really need to have you back onto the program, and maybe you could offer some more elaboration on your research into the Italian history of worker autonomy and other related matters. But did you have a brief response to what Conrad said you'd like to mention?
Well, I was, yeah, thank you, Daniel. I'd love to actually get back and elaborate on some ideas and things we've been talking today. A brief response. I think, yeah, it's hard to argue against that we have to historicize Althusser's response to Gramsci, as well as, you know, Gramsci's work, and I think it's known that his ideas are very uneven, and from notebook to notebook, they change, and they kind of get, and he uses same concept and notion in a totally different context. But the one thing was quite striking is about reformism, or one could add Eurocommunism, that we probably tend to dissociate with Gramsci's work. I think if we are coherent and consistent in our attempt to historicize things, then I guess it has to do little with Gramscian work as such, but rather with Gramscians, with people who worked with his legacy back then and brought, and brought his ideas from Italy, like outside of Italy, and popularized them. That we have to historicize this kind of stuff, right? And reformism, Eurocommunism, of course, but these types of socialist strategy have to do with a very particular way of reading Gramsci.
Thank you so much, Marina, for that clarification and for your insights. I will not forget the three pillars, and I may have to steal those from you, like in my own formulation of what Marxism is. But it's an egalitarian tradition, so maybe you will be okay. There's no property ownership over those definitions.
Absolutely.
You'll have to pardon me, comrades. I have like some kind of weird summer cold of some sort, but look, okay, I'm going to be a pest one more time and remind you to buy a copy of Flowers for Marx by Revolt Press right here, and revoltpress.com/flowers. You can find this also, I think, on Amazon if you wish to be so devilish and evil so as to support Amazon. I don't know what our position is on that, but it's probably.
Bezos got a $50 million wedding going on right now in Venice, so people got to chip in, and
that's right. We got to chip in, so he can afford to purchase another yacht. Just kidding. Okay, so wonderful, Marina. Thank you so much. You're more than welcome to stay with us if you wish, but you've also been with us for a while, so you can also bounce. I'm very pleased now to introduce our final guest for the stream, Bram Gieben, who is a writer on culture and ideas. He is, give me one second, an editor and co-founder of Revolt Press. I believe co-founder is accurate. You can clarify that. But he is the author of a book entitled The Darkest Timeline, Living in a World with No Future in 2024. It came out in 2024. He's also the host of the Philosophically Curious podcast called Strange Exiles. And Bram has written for the Glasgow Review of Books, Sublation Magazine, The Quietist, and other places. So, Bram, we thought we would bring you on to wrap this all up, to tell us primarily about Revolt Press. But I am going to terrorize you like I've terrorized the other guests. And I'm going to ask you for a first question, which you must answer, which is, what is Marxism for you, my friend?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion tonight. I've been watching on YouTube in the background, and just the level of discourse going on in terms of different interpretations of Marx, views on other people like Althusser. It's been a real eye-opener for me. My involvement with Revolt, I came aboard as an editor a little after Mike had set up the press. But, I'm a cultural critic, really, rather than an academic. My background's kind of in the analysis of music and films and things like that. Like, you'd probably be more likely to find me talking about the politics of a film like They Live or Mickey 17 than you would find me kind of, expanding on what Marx means to me personally. But I'll certainly give it a bash. I think for me, I'm definitely a leftist. I believe in what Slavoj Žižek calls the universality of the excluded, and I think in our era, that category really includes more and more of us, and that kind of connects to a little bit of what I was writing about in my book. I think we have some assumptions that our worldview, our social world, our political world is going to continue. And I think those claims kind of might be overstated. So I kind of examine that a little bit in the book. But I'm also a skeptic, I think, when it comes to Marx in a certain sense. I'm not sure that I think Marxist revolution is possible or likely. And that's why I try to spend my time with people who do have that belief, and learn from them. I guess unlike Fox Mulder in that sense, I want to believe. It was an education for me reading Flowers for Marx as I was helping to copy and proof it. I think, it's an important book, I think, for this moment. It's very timely. We face such steep challenges at the moment as a society, as a global society. What could Marx offer in terms of ways to think about that, ways to maybe solve some of those problems? I think as well, the parts of the book that spoke to me a great deal were, first of all, the arguments against censorship. I guess I'm a little bit libertarian in my approach to that, which is maybe, a counter to certain tendencies on the left. But the book is really a conversation between, some very, very smart people about aspects of Marx and what he could mean for this current moment. And in that sense, I think it's really important and timely. You get the sense reading it of kind of an open adversarial debate, but without antagonism. And I think that really shows a way forward for how leftist politics could proceed. There's a sense that what the book is doing is kind of showing by doing. We've got to figure out what Marxist thought means to us now, as much as we have, to understand the history of Marxist thought. So I think that's really important. I think for me, Marxism is a belief in communitarianism as opposed to individuality. It's the idea of a potential of collective purpose. But I think, these ideas have to be fought for. They're kind of ineffective at scale if people aren't prepared to fight for them. My route into kind of leftist thought was through, obviously, Mark Fisher. I kind of discovered the K-punk blog at a very early influential age. And, off the back of that, I found my way to Žižek, Stuart Hall, Fred Jameson, and eventually to Mike Watson's work as well. I really love some of Mike's early books, particularly towards a conceptual militancy. I like the way that Mike is able to link aesthetics to discussions of Marxism and other political theories. And that's, I guess, maybe a little bit of an insight into what Revolt's about. This book is a book of political writing. I think a lot of our other books are going to use aesthetics to talk about politics. I'm not sure if I've got much to comment on in terms of the central themes of the book, but I guess a question I would ask is like whether the question of Marx being scientifically sound is necessarily one that we have to tarry with too much. I think we just need it. We need alternative theories to hegemony. We need alternative theories to techno-feudalism. I think, in terms of, that Žižek quote about the universality of the excluded, that kind of communitarianism, that kind of global movement is probably all that could defeat techno-feudalism and deal with threats like climate change. So it's really interesting to see that analyzed and argued about at length in the book. I've really enjoyed working on it for sure.
Wonderful, Bram. And people are commenting on the Žižek shirt. I have my own Žižek shirt. Something very traumatic happened to me when I was in grad school. I submitted a paper to a Žižek conference, and it actually surprisingly won the first place award. And then so I got to like meet Slavoj Žižek when I was like younger, and like fundamentally changed my life. And I was like, I was like really like, okay, now I have to be Žižekian, Over time, actually my Marxism it made me kind of diverge from him, which is a whole separate topic. But I actually wanted to ask you if you could tell us about Revolt Press, and specifically how you might characterize sort of like the role that you're trying to play on the left. Because I think one of the interesting things about Revolt Press, and this might be something for people listening that are themselves authors or interested in becoming a writer, maybe you're younger, you say, and I think Mike says this too, that you sort of take an author-focused promotional approach. What does that mean? That's one question. And then I guess the second question is, can you speak more broadly to the type of role you're trying to fulfill or function you're trying to play as a press on the left?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think one thing that Mike and I are very concerned about is how fractious the left can be, and how that's maybe sometimes in opposition to the goals it might have. Burgess, I think, has called this the circular firing squad of the left, although maybe he didn't originate that phrase. So if I could say maybe a little bit about what Revolt is intended to be a counterpoint to, I don't think we're trying to get into the thick of it with factionalism or arguments between leftists. I think if we were to engage in dialogue about what is or isn't Marxism or leftism, the place for that is within the pages of a book like Flowers for Marx. For me, that's a big thing. I think as well. Mike's background is in the art world, so we're very, very interested in things like the Frankfurt School and its critiques of different kinds of aesthetics. In terms of it being author focused, I mean, one thing we offer is a larger proportion of the profits of the books to authors themselves. Now, obviously, we're quite a small press at the moment. We don't sell a ton of books, so this is largely a theoretical model, perhaps. But we hope over time we would be able to give people space to publish books that are, I guess, more focused on what their particular set of interests are, exploring thinkers that they're interested in bringing to light or exploring in different ways, and giving them space to do that, and then a big slice of the profits if that if it does end up selling some. I think as well, for us, social media, clout, virality, infighting on the left, these are things that we're trying to be less of a part of than perhaps other presses aim to be. I think as well, social media is obviously a big theme in Mike's last book. He wrote about digital addiction and capitalism in Hungry Ghosts in the Machine. And it's a difficult one. Like we were talking about this on a stream with Cadell last at Philosophy Portal. And there's kind of an inherent contradiction there. You sort of have to be online in order to promote books if you're selling them. But at the same time, I think we're trying to go away from the idea of sort of chasing likes, chasing numbers, chasing clout, even necessarily chasing big sales. We'd be quite happy to publish a book that we were really, really passionate about, and hopefully make back the money. So I think that talks that kind of touches on a few of the avenues we're trying to explore. I think as well, we'd just like to expand it a little bit. As I say, I'm a big Zizek and Fisher head. Mike is very much, oriented around the Frankfurt School. So we'd like it to be a broad church. We'd love to see books and essays from writers who explore things like Gramsci or Althusser or, any of the other thinkers that have been mentioned tonight. So yeah, it's very early days. We're a very small press at the moment. We're in this for the long game, I think you could say. So yeah, maybe the answer of what Revolt Press is will change a little bit over the next few years.
And you guys are great editors, we must say. We appreciate your work in that regard. It's very meticulous. And I know Conrad has a comment. You want to jump in, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I think it's interesting because you were touching on certain themes here that are obviously very pertinent for our moment. Kind of censorship was one of them, right? Or, how we, the liberty with which we speak. Another one was, should we favor a kind of agonistic model? And I guess the way I see this, and for the book, for the foreword, Daniel wrote a wonderful essay in which he talked about the struggles with censorship experienced by the young Marx, in the context of the German state at that time, in the 1840s and so forth, and how, in a fundamental sense, it was Marx's rejection, right, of the entente with the state, right, and the new liberal monarch, right, that drove him towards a more radical position and ultimately towards communism, right, or into this kind of brick that's theorized in a way by Louis Althusser. And Tutt draws some conclusions from that, including, that we have to resist what we've seen over the past few years, which is an increasing tendency for a kind of collusion between Marxism and the liberal establishment, right? That we have to establish a kind of counterpublic. And one thing I did push him a little bit on, and I love the essay. One thing I did push him on a little bit was, I think it's great historical work. I do think that when it comes to the question of censorship, we do have to, rather than just treating it as an ideal, we do have to relate it to politics and our goals, right? And what are we trying to achieve? And I thought it was quite cute, because one thing Tutt points out is that historically there's been this support censorship by a number of liberal intellectuals. They always have this, right? Kant, you can find it in an essay even. Locke, also in terms of his practical engagements. But I thought the case of Rousseau was interesting because I in a way, I kind of like how Rousseau approaches the question of censorship, because what he says is that, censorship can help preserve like a virtuous society, right, under certain circumstances, but it can't create a virtuous society. What that, and what, and of course, what also, so he gives to give you an example of this, right? He talks about like, this of a kind of indigenous society in European, right? And, and he says like they would have been correct to burn like all the European books, like the moment they arrived, right? To try to safeguard themselves, right, from the adverse impacts that were going to hit them. Of course, when he looks at modern Europe and the Europe which had censored him, as it were, conveniently, he's a lot more critical, right? And he sees this as just being. But I think that there's something that is true about this, which is that censorship has to be related to what are the actual political aims you're trying to achieve, right? And in this sense, like if I think of kind of, because we'll talk a lot about kind of liberal censure or cancel culture. And I think often the problem is not, to be clear, that people are being gone after or anything like that. And obviously, even if we talk about violence, I mean, what is it compared to the terror in France or all these other things, right? But it's the way that it's actually done, right? So you talked about Zizek. Zizek has made this point about, kind of Me Too and the way it works, right? Where it's like, Louis C.K. is canceled because he exposed himself to a few women or someone on the phone. But Emma Watson or U2 evade taxes systematically, but like that's okay, right? So it's symptomatic, right, of the entire exclusion of class, right? As a sort of matrix for assessing society by the liberal status quo. And I think that this is, particularly catastrophic because, like, in a way, the significance of class, or what Lukács would call the proletarian standpoint, and I love when, my favorite quote by Lukács, he says, the proletariat can see reality objectively because it is objectified, right? It's such a great encapsulation of that. But I think that, part of it, which is so rich, is it's like class, just class, right? So, it's precisely the illusion, like in the standpoint of the proletariat, that allows us to begin to understand the totality of economic relations and the way they function. And it's in understanding that totality that we're going to understand, the structural role that racialization plays within it, sub-proletarian black labor in the United States, for example, right? The world market, right? The structural role that gender plays within it, right? Socially reproductive labor, and so on and so forth. So I think that that's very important. But I feel much the same way about conflict in general, right? Which is like, it's not a question of, conflict versus not conflict. What kind of conflict are we fighting?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the entire class agenda, right, through which often we've called cancel culture, you talk about the cancellation of this book by Punctum, the way that that's executed, there often is, which isn't into the promotion of socialism. Mark Fisher, who of course, it's not like a scientific analysis, but even if we go to Vampire Castle, right, he talks about, the linking up with it with the kind of petit bourgeois ethos and liberal politics and this kind of thing. So I just want to add that, like, I think I share some of your tendencies in this regard, but I would just insist upon also their politicization in a certain way,
Absolutely. No, you made some good points there. I mean, I think a lot of the contributors tonight have talked about a desire to push, leftist organizing or Marxist thought back towards class and economics. And I think, that's absolutely something that I would agree with that needs to happen. If I have a critique of identity politics, it's that it fits very well with this idea of neoliberal individualism. It's a way of looking at things that can, reflect back onto the self through these defined identity categories. And I just don't know how useful that is for organizing or for thinking through these ideas. I mean, I think like the recent election of Zoran Mamdani, for instance, gives me hope. I think the reason that he's connecting with people is that he's promising people things that they want. And you can make the argument that he's, not so far to the left and maybe shouldn't be considered therefore a champion of the left. I've certainly seen that argument made. But, if you want to talk about cancel culture, I'm less interested in, the cancellation of an academic for, certain allegations against them for behavior, or indeed, the idea of somebody being cancelled for wrongthink. These are things that happen, and it's valid to talk about them. But something like what happened to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK is probably a more salient example of cancel culture at scale. I think like what happened to Corbyn when he was kind of smeared as an anti-Semite was really a really big betrayal of a youth movement that had coalesced around a set of policies that would have brought us at least one or two steps closer to, a more fair and just world. So even if you have criticisms of Corbynism, which I very much do, to kind of rule out that leftist position, to, portray it as, I think one of the things they said when Corbyn was very close to being elected is that he wouldn't push the red button. He wouldn't send a nuke if the situation arose. I think that's actually something that the young people that were following him would have largely agreed with, So that the idea that something like Corbynism can kind of be smothered in the cradle, despite its large popular support, that to me is the bigger issue of cancel culture. And if you look at what happened after Corbyn in the UK Labour Party, you've got Starmer, and he's kind of the opposite of that. Like, he might talk about getting through moderate leftist goals, but in order to do that, he's got to submit to the neoliberal agenda. He's got to kind of echo the racist talking points of groups like Reform. Like I was born in 1980, so for most of my childhood, I was watching Thatcherism unfold, and we saw the union shattered. We saw the complete breaking of the left under Thatcher. So this sense of coming out of an era of conservatism and into an era where leftist politics seemed, at least, on a couple of occasions, to be at least a more credible source, at the actual ballot box. There have been moments of hope there, So it's the smothering of that kind of stuff that I think is really the greater concern. To go back to Zizek for a moment, I think like one of the reasons I think Zizek's such an important thinker is that he saw the collapse of the communist system. He was watching a particular life world collapse around him. So that's why books like Living in the End Times are so important for me, because I think that it's very easy to sit in a liberal democracy in the West and not have a sense of what it would seem like if that were to collapse. And that's what I'm interested in, because I do think that we might be approaching a point of collapse of the current systems that we've got. I don't know if you saw Trauma Zone, which was the last but one documentary by Adam Curtis, and it was a lot of footage from Russia around the time of the fall of the USSR. And I think like he really captured, I mean, he's a filmmaker that kind of is about vibes as much as he is about the subject matter. And you get a powerful sense from that film of what it's like to live in a culture which is dissolving or collapsing. So yeah, I think these issues are important. And to return to the idea of debate and disagreement, I very much agree with you. It's not that disagreement is bad. It's not that debate is bad, or that we can't have actual, strong disagreements.
Yeah, or violence, to be clear. I meant violence as well.
Violence too, yeah. But, maybe leaving aside violence, like there are productive places where we can have these discussions, where we can talk about, like rupture is a theme in the book. I think it's important that there are different views on this and that we find a space to debate them that doesn't have the consequence of, somebody being accused of wrongthink for not towing the party line.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in on some of these points, I mean, I think it's interesting that, I think that the legacy of the strategy of what we call no platforming is sort of hasn't aged too well in my view, in the sense that, it's often the case that people will construe, usually through proximity to particular thinkers, a kind of wrong think or a type of reaction. And what we find is this sort of incommensurability or asynchronicity between the 60s and our time. And this is something that Mark Fisher in his late work was very keen upon, which was how does one sort of historically address that incommensurability? Primarily the fact that the left was a countercultural libertine left, but materially it was permitted to be so largely because of welfare state affordances and the fact that the future was open, right? So you have this asynchronicity whereby today a lot of the models and thinkers and frameworks and philosophies that we conceive of the very meaning of the left were forged in a moment that has no bearing on our material realities, right? And yet nonetheless, there's huge segments of the left that will sort of ape or follow these lines regarding Foucault's thesis in the Introduction to Anti-Oedipus, a guide to non-fascist living. The implication there is that fascism is ubiquitous in some sense, right? And I think that this becomes a question ultimately of class in a certain way, in the sense that, well, how can the left, and here I think Marx, in the early Marx, is extremely instructive, in the sense that Marx is trying to not repeat the same errors of liberalism. He's trying to overcome what he called pseudo-liberalism. So oftentimes, leftists today that believe in no platforming will say to those Marxists that wish to debate and that want to actually engage reactionaries, let's say, they will say, well, that's actually, you're being liberal in a certain way by trying to convince them of Marxism. To which I would respond that, well, what actually is liberal? In some sense, perhaps only Marxists can teach liberals the meaning of these things today, would be one contention I would have, actually. I don't know what Conrad or what Bram you think of that, but, and then a final point would be on Rousseau's theory of censorship is very fascinating, because he also maintained the view that I think Marx probably would entertain as well, which is that there's almost like a rational capacity amongst the masses for censoring themselves and their excessiveness. So there's almost like, you could say, a sort of trust in the masses of collective self-censorship, because that's the other thing, is that half of censorship is self-censorship, meaning that the effects of the state's imposition of censorship is an effect of mind control. for which we all, in some sense, maybe not are victims, that might be too strong of a word, but we all are having to navigate that fact, right? So those are some thoughts on this thing, and perhaps in future Archimedean points or future programs, we can actually dig more into some of these themes. And of course, the good news is you can read about it in a book called Flowers for Marx, which is now available on Revolt Press, and everybody in the chat's going to buy one. Yeah, right, chat. I just want to thank everybody for a very spirited chat, by the way, a comradely chat. We've gone through 5 or 6 guests, and it's been really great. Any thoughts in closing, Bram, you want to leave with us? Here's a question for some final comments. How does someone learn more about Revolt Press? Maybe, I don't know, buy a book, or maybe pitch a book that they want to write, or give us like some more practical tips how people can actually engage Revolt.
No problem. No, thank you for those last thoughts as well. I think, you know, one important thing to say about Revolt is that we're very much opposed to the idea of orthodoxy or monoculture. We consider ourselves a vanguard of counterculture, and I hope that's something that we can continue to like build on and expand upon. We have numerous ways that you can contribute. We're going to be opening submissions again at some point. We will be looking for new books. I think we have books programmed up until perhaps 2027, if I'm right, in terms of how much we can, you know, output we can do as two people with full-time day jobs as well. But certainly we're going to be looking at seeking new submissions soon. And if you check out the website, there's a little bit about some upcoming compendiums. We hope to do more of those. We have one dropping next year called What's Left of Metal, which looks at you know, whether there is a potential for leftist thought or organizing within the heavy metal genre and community. The other thing I would say is come find us on Substack. We're at revoltpress.substack.com. This week we published a piece by Matt McManus, kind of introducing some of the themes from Flowers for Marx. And I'm keen to get essays from other people outside of Revolt's orbit to publish there as well, hopefully. So yeah, we're definitely open for pitches. You can contact us as well at revoltpress.com. Always good to hear from people and find out what projects they're involved in, what they're writing. So yeah, while submissions for entire books are not open at the moment, we definitely want to hear from people. We also have a podcast called Theorize and Be Damned. Last episode of that, we spoke to Sudeep Bhattacharya about organizing communities of color in socialism. That was a fascinating chat. Perhaps we can get yourself back on as well, Conrad. I think we had a chat with you before. Daniel, you'd also be very welcome too. And yes, some of the guests tonight were absolutely fascinating. So we'll be poaching your guest list, Daniel, and reaching out to a few of them, I'm sure. But yeah, come find us on YouTube. Come find us on Substack. And we have a meme page as well called Dialectical Meme Stash on Instagram, which is run by Mike, and that's definitely worth checking out.
All right, excellent. Well, I think we've reached our conclusion for the Flowers for Marx stream. I just want to thank everybody for their attention and for this sort of whirlwind set of interviews and discussions that were very, I think, hopefully enriching for folks. I mean it sincerely to please please pick up the book. I think you'll genuinely enjoy it. A lot of these academic presses have like suspect financial schemes that they're a part of, but as you heard from Bram, Revolt is extremely independent and it deserves our support. So that's all I'm going to say about that, and then I'll kick it up to Conrad for maybe some final comments or remarks.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that one thing that we Bram, you mentioned that you were very happy about the Mamdani victory, and earlier, Tutt, you said we should mention this, so maybe this is an appropriate thing to close on.
I forgot to mention it. Please.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's an interesting timing, right? Because, this book was stimulated, obviously, by, as I mentioned before, a lot of the difficulties that were being faced by democratic socialism at different levels, and the hopes of engaging a critical conversation about it. I don't think that anything we've seen in terms of Mamdani winning the incumbency fundamentally changes that, but nevertheless, it is a big moment. We'll see what happens. I mean, it was incredible to see him overcome Kumo in terms of the vested interests were there. I think the moment he won when they had that exchange about Israel, I don't know if you saw it, where it was quite South Park-esque in a way, but they asked everyone where they were going to be going to their next country, and people said, I'm going to our great ally, Israel, and our great. And Mamdani said, I'm going to stay in New York and deal with the concerned constituents here. And then he was immediately accused of being kind of bigot, right? Because this is like, he was saying, like, I support equal rights for all, right? But such is the nature of our current discourse, right? That people actually accuse you of anti-Semitism. If you dare to suggest that, Israel should have a system formally and legally similar to the United States itself. But it's a big moment. But I also worry a little bit. And I do worry that, I think it's very, very hard to be a radical mayor, right? Provided that he wins ultimately, because it's such a big issue. And we talk about, fiscal dumping between nations, but it's been such a phenomenon in the United States, wealth flight, and often, white flight, really, which just, obviously there's a correlation as well, when more thorough tax programs are implemented. So I feel like the very nature of the municipal structure, right, tends to encourage a more kind of conciliatory perspective. And I hope that doesn't nurse or encourage the idea of democratic socialism as being ineffectual. But the other aspect of it, I think, is that I worry as well that the retreat, it's interesting, this is a local victory, because I worry that this is kind of like a compensation prize, right? For the failure of national coalition building in the 2010s. And of course, we know that Sanders was always popular in New York. We know that he was always popular in Seattle. We know he was popular in Portland, right? That wasn't the issue, right? Let us remember that it was, South Carolina, right, was where Biden really emerged as someone who could kind of, it's the failures of Sanders and this kind of environments that really allowed that to happen. So I think that it's nice, but we shouldn't be too, but I want to say finally as well, I just think with all of this, it's like, I mentioned before that, the quote by Jameson, right? We have to support social democracy because its failure is a necessary condition for the creation of something more. And, to talk about the kind of, you called it, I think, debate without antagonism, Bram, when you were talking about this, to talk about the conditions that kind of facilitate this. I mean, I have very, very sharp and profound, disagreements with Matt, also with Ben, though it's not as dialogical with him on that level. But, I also recognize, like, if we look at history, right, you always had this kind of process. I mean, if you look at, even in China, like you look at the movement from the nationalists to the communists, right? You look at the evolution of a kind of democracy, right, towards Bolshevism, right? In Russia, the Russian Revolution. So I think it's like you can tell people about these things, right? You can say that, oh, well, this kind of reform program, isn't work in a certain setting. But I do think that, as a class, as a generation, as a constituency of people, it's very, very necessary to go through that experience yourself. And, we have to remember as well, Lenin, he never stopped, citing Plekhanov or denied, the validity of what they'd written. So again, I have very sharp and emphatic disagreements with democratic socialism in its current state. But I also think that wherever we're going now, and however failed it was as a project, I think that we can't deny that experience of failure, right, and the level of practical experience that it's provided people with is going to be an essential building block for anything that happens in the future. So I call for a greater radicalization, but I'm also conscious of all of the foundational pillars that have to be erected, for a true and effective radicalism that isn't merely performative or an anarchist gesture to actually develop. So those are my final thoughts.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that there's a lot to study about local sort of mayoral socialism in America that's worth looking at. The Socialist Party: A Complete History by Jack Ross gets into a lot of these details. There is actually a more recent record of socialist-leaning ideological mayors. Most of them are affiliated with the Democratic Party. I think that the constraints regarding the paternalism of the Democratic Party on these local politicians will prove to be overwhelming to their agendas in most cases. And if anything, I think that the Marxist thrust or sort of instructive point would be about the construction of a socialist party that would have class independence, which the Democrats would never permit and would always foreclose. So, you know, apropos Jameson's point, right, about the failures of social democracy leading to something, I don't think one needs to take a strong accelerationist pessimism with that point. No, it's a process. It's a process which we should honor the fact that the millennial left has a victory, which, yes, it is symbolic, but it is imbuing something in, it's injecting something. And we need to avoid the sort of inevitable hero worship that seems to be brewing in regards to this whole thing. So there's a lot of watch out fors, but there's a lot of reason for a kind of measured optimism. But as C. Derek Varn always says, when you have a victory like this, first of all, this is the moment not to sort of rest on your laurels, but actually to really begin to hold these figures accountable. This is when the work starts. It's not like, because that's kind of what bourgeois politics wants, right? It wants you to conceive of the politician as some sort of transactional relationship where they make you feel good. So I think the danger would be to sort of adopt this rhetorical idealism about Mamdani, where effectively, you know, he becomes like an Obama socialist. No, that's like the last thing we want, to be sort of caught. And I think that the liberals would use him. They would use his rhetorical flourishes and his speechifying skills against him, right? They're going to use everything they can against him, right? And we need to be prepared for that without question. So that's what I have to say to that. Well, anyways, it's been real. I just want to thank everyone again for a great stream. Let's do it again soon. I'm trying this summer to do Friday streams. I have a few planned. Just to give you a sense, I have a conversation coming up with a great scholar on socialist realism. I have another one on Leninism and strategy that's going to be very exciting coming up soon. Very practical conversation. And then I have a very, very important symposium that we will be hosting with Joan Kopchak, the great Lacanian philosopher Joan Kopchak, in her new book called Cloud: Between Paris and Tehran, which is a study of Iranian cinema. Henri Corbin, the French Sufi philosopher, and Lacan. So Islamic philosophy, Lacan, and Iranian cinema in August. Stay tuned for that. Like and subscribe, buy the book, support Revolt Press, and we will see you next time.